Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Story Relaxing. Tonight we step carefully into the frozen world of colonial New England during the deadly winter of 1692, where the wind cuts through pine forest like a blade, and every breath hangs pale in the darkness before disappearing into the night air. You stand near a rough wooden settlement beside the Massachusetts coastline, while snow crunches beneath stiff leather boots and smoke drifts slowly from cabin chimneys into a grey sky that somehow already looks tired. The cold reaches through wool gloves, through stockings, through every hopeful life decision that brought you here in the first place. And just to keep expectations realistic, you probably would not survive this winter without losing at least several toenails and most of your optimism. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in tonight, feel free to share your location and local time down in the comments. It is always strangely comforting knowing who else is awake somewhere out there listening to sleepy historical suffering together. Now dim the lights and let the snow begin falling around you. The year is 1692, and winter in colonial Massachusetts does not politely arrive. It invades, it presses through cracks in walls, freezes water buckets solid overnight, and turns every simple task into a small, exhausting battle against nature. You stand near the edge of the settlement, watching the ocean churn darkly beneath sheets of ice while cold wind slips under your cloak with deeply personal hostility. The colony smells of smoke constantly, pine smoke, wet smoke, smoke trapped inside wool blankets and beards and rough linen shirts. After enough weeks, people stop noticing it. Your hair smells like a fireplace, your boots smell like damp leather and regret. A commonly accepted historical reality is that winters during the late 17th century fell within part of the Little Ice Age, a period of colder temperatures that affected Europe and North America for generations. Colonial settlers in New England faced especially brutal conditions because many settlements lacked sturdy infrastructure, reliable food reserves, and proper insulation during the colder months. You pull your cloak tighter while nearby settlers move carefully through packed snow paths between cabins. Nobody wastes movement here. Every trip outdoors costs energy. Every chore demands effort from muscles already tired by cold mornings and interrupted sleep. A woman carries a wooden bucket toward the well, carefully balancing herself on icy ground polished smooth by repeated footsteps. Nearby, two boys drag frozen branches toward a woodpile while pretending not to complain about it. One mutters something dramatic about dying heroically in the wilderness. Honestly, fair enough. The cabins themselves crouch low against the wind. They are small. Rough structures built from timber cut by hand, their roofs thick with snow. Some windows contain oiled paper instead of glass because actual glass remains expensive and difficult to transport across the Atlantic. At night, candlelight glows faintly through the pale coverings like tired little moons. Inside one cabin, warmth gathers unevenly around a stone hearth where a fire crackles softly. The room smells of stew, damp wool, and old ash. You feel heat against your face while your back remains freezing cold because colonial heating technology still has several centuries left before becoming remotely reasonable. A broadly recognized fact from colonial domestic history is that most families spent nearly all winter activities gathered close to the hearth. Cooking, sewing, repairing tools, preparing food, and even sleeping often happened within reach of the fire because the rest of the cabin remained dangerously cold. You sit beside the flames while someone hangs wet stockings from a wooden peg overhead. They steam gently in the heat, releasing the sharp scent of thawing wool into the room. Nearby, a kettle hums softly while frost creeps faintly along the inside corners of the walls. The father of the household studies the fire constantly. Colonists become experts at reading flames the way modern people read phone notifications. Too weak, and the room chills quickly. Too strong, and precious wood disappears too fast. Wood means survival. Everything becomes connected to wood. Warmth, cooking, light, safety, hope, Outside, snow continues drifting silently across the settlement. The sound changes out there during winter. Snow absorbs noise, softens footsteps, quiets distant voices. Sometimes entire nights pass beneath an eerie stillness broken only by cracking ice or the distant barking of dogs. Some settlers claim the silence itself feels dangerous. And honestly, you understand. One unusual detail occasionally mentioned in surviving colonial accounts is that some families slept wearing knit caps specifically designed for nighttime warmth. A few settlers even heated stones near the fire before wrapping them in cloth and placing them inside beds as primitive warming devices, which sounds cozy until one cracks open beside your feet at 2 a.m, and suddenly bedtime becomes much more exciting than intended. Historians still debate whether many poorer families remained in dangerously underheated cabins throughout the harshest winters, or whether neighbours regularly crowded together for warmth more often than official records suggest. Personal diaries from the period vary widely depending on wealth, location, and sheer stubbornness. You glance toward the small table where tonight's meal waits beneath dim candlelight. Salted pork, brown bread, thin cabbage stew, nothing luxurious, nothing excessive. Every bite matters during winter because supply ships may not arrive for months if storms worsen along the coast. The stew smells earthy and faintly smoky. Steam rises slowly from wooden bowls while tired hands cradle them gratefully. Nobody eats quickly, food must last. A child near the hearth fights sleep while trying to finish supper. His cheeks glow pink from heat and cold together. Every few moments his head droops forward before jerking awake again. The adults barely notice. Everyone is exhausted here. Colonial winter exhaustion feels different from modern tiredness. Not annoyance, not inconvenience, bone-deep weariness. The kind earned through hauling water in darkness while snow stings your face sideways. You step closer to the doorway and carefully lift the latch. Cold air immediately spills inward, carrying the scent of pine forests and distant seawater. Snowflakes twist through the opening before melting against the warm floorboards. Far beyond the settlement, endless woods stretch beneath moonlight. The trees look almost black against the snow. Beautiful, threatening, indifferent. And somewhere out there beyond those forests, beyond frozen rivers and rough mountain trails, entire indigenous communities survive winters with knowledge settlers still struggle to understand properly. Some colonists quietly borrow techniques for hunting, snow travel, and food storage while publicly pretending otherwise. Pride survives even when common sense occasionally freezes solid. You close the door again quickly because your fingers already ache from the cold latch. The fire pops sharply behind you. Someone sighs softly. Outside, the storm deepens, and winter in 1692 is only beginning. Morning arrives quietly beneath heavy clouds and pale blue frost spreading across the settlement roofs. You wake beneath rough wool blankets with one shoulder still cold despite sleeping practically inside the fireplace overnight. The fire has faded into glowing embers. Smoke lingers faintly near the rafters, somewhere outside. Boots crunch through frozen snow with the steady rhythm of people already working long before sunrise. The cabin groans softly around you. Timber contracts in the cold, wind pushes against the walls, frost traces delicate white veins across the corners of the tiny windows. For a moment, lying there half awake beside the dim heat, you almost forget how dangerous this season actually is. Then your nose freezes slightly. Reality returns immediately. The cabin protecting you from winter is not much larger than a modern living room. Several people sleep here together, because heat gathers better in crowded spaces. The air smells of smoke, damp linen, cooked cabbage, and pine sap leaking faintly from rough beams overhead. A well-established detail from colonial architecture is that many New England homes in the late 17th century were built quickly with local timber, packed clay, and handmade materials that offered only limited protection against severe cold. Insulation barely existed by modern standards, and drafts slipped constantly through walls, floors, doors, and roofs. You sit up slowly while your breath clouds the air. Near the hearth, the mother kneels beside the ashes, coaxing life back into the fire. Her movements feel automatic now. One hand feeds splinters beneath the coals while the other wraps tightly around her shawl. The flames rise carefully, almost reluctantly, before finally crackling into stronger light. That fire has become the centre of existence. Not decoration, not comfort, existence. Without it, the cabin transforms from uncomfortable to dangerous frighteningly fast. You pull on stiff stockings that never fully dried overnight. The fabric scratches against cold skin while your boots wait beside the wall like small wooden prisons. Colonial footwear during winter tends to absorb snow, freeze solid, and develop mysterious dampness apparently generated by pure historical malice. Outside, dawn spreads slowly across the settlement. Smoke curls upward from chimneys into still grey air, while snowdrifts lean heavily against cabin walls. You notice immediately how closely the houses sit together. Families build near one another partly for protection, partly because shared labour means survival, and honestly, partly because freezing alone in the wilderness sounds terrible. You step toward one nearby cabin carrying an armful of split wood. The cold bites sharply at your face, snow squeaks beneath your boots with that strange dry sound only deep winter creates. Somewhere beyond the houses, an axe strikes timber in slow, steady intervals. Thunk! Pause. Thunk! The entire colony survives through repetition. Inside the neighbouring cabin, warmth feels stronger, but the air hangs thick with smoke. A baby fusses softly near the hearth, while an older woman patches torn mittens beside weak morning light filtering through oiled paper windows. The walls themselves reveal the struggle against winter. Blankets hang across doorways to trap heat. Moss and clay have been stuffed between logs to block drafts. Extra animal skins cover sleeping areas. Every surface serves some practical purpose. Nothing here exists casually. One fascinating tidbit found in several colonial household records is that some settlers occasionally kept heated bricks wrapped in cloth near their feet during meals or prayer services. Unfortunately, overheated bricks sometimes cracked apart unexpectedly, which probably added excitement to otherwise very serious Puritan evenings. You glance upward toward the low ceiling where strips of drying meat hang beside herbs and onions. Smoke from the hearth darkens the beams gradually year after year, until everything overhead carries a permanent soot-stained appearance. The colony's houses rarely remain truly clean. Smoke coats fabric, mud covers floors, ash settles everywhere. Winter enters constantly despite everyone's efforts. A point many researchers agree upon is that maintaining warmth often mattered far more than maintaining cleanliness during severe New England winters. Settlers accepted smoky interiors, crowded sleeping arrangements, and limited ventilation because opening windows too often risked dangerous heat loss. You move toward the rear corner of the cabin where water buckets sit partially frozen. Thin sheets of ice float across the surface despite being indoors beside the fire all night. Someone breaks the ice carefully using a wooden spoon before carrying the bucket toward the cooking pot. Even water refuses cooperation here. The father returns through the doorway carrying fresh-cut timber across his shoulders. Snow clings to his beard. His gloves look stiff with frost. He stamps heavily at the entrance before coming fully inside because nobody wants half the forest melting onto the floorboards. The moment the door opens, cold air rushes through the room like an invisible animal. Everyone notices immediately. People living through colonial winters become strangely sensitive to temperature shifts. A weak draft near your ankles feels practically offensive. You begin mentally tracking warm corners the way cats do. Near the fire, the family gathers for breakfast. Thick porridge bubbles slowly inside an iron pot while steam fogs the dim windows. The smell is plain but comforting. Oats, smoke, salt, survival. Nobody complains much about repetitive meals anymore. Hunger simplifies preferences very efficiently. Historians still discuss how much regional building knowledge settlers adapted from indigenous communities during harsh winters. Some evidence suggests colonists learned practical techniques involving insulation, food storage, and seasonal preparation, though many official records minimize native influence for political and cultural reasons. You notice the floor beneath your boots remains uneven and rough. Tiny gaps between planks allow cold air upward from below the cabin. Mice occasionally appear through those same gaps searching for warmth and crumbs. The family reacts with weary acceptance rather than surprise. At this point, even the mice are just fellow tenants trying not to freeze. Outside again. You walk slowly between cabins while pale sunlight finally touches the snowfields surrounding the settlement. The beauty almost distracts you from the hardship. Frost sparkles across fences, pine branches bend beneath thick white layers. Smoke drifts peacefully above the rooftops. It would look idyllic in a painting. The painting would absolutely leave out the frozen laundry and chronic exhaustion. A pair of boys work together stuffing additional moss into cracks along one cabin wall, using sticks and bare fingers reddened by cold. Nearby, a woman shakes snow from blankets hanging stiff as boards beside the doorway. Every family repairs constantly. Roofs leak, walls shift, doors warp. Winter never stops testing the houses, and the houses never fully win. You pause beside the edge of the settlement where forest shadows darken beneath the morning sky. Beyond those trees waits endless cold wilderness stretching mile after mile across frozen rivers and silent hills. The cabins behind you seem small suddenly, fragile, temporary, little pockets of firelight pressed against enormous winter darkness. Yet somehow people endure here year after year. One repaired roof, one stubborn fire, one freezing morning at a... The problem with winter fires is that they are always hungry. You notice this almost immediately after another freezing dawn settles over the colony. No matter how much wood disappears into the hearth, the flames never seem impressed. They crackle briefly, glow warmly for an hour or two, then begin demanding more timber, like spoiled little monarchs ruling over everyone's survival. And unfortunately, they are absolutely in charge. You stand outside beside the woodpile while pale sunlight filters weakly through clouds the colour of old wool blankets. Snow covers the ground in uneven ridges, hardened by repeated freezing and thawing. Your breath drifts upward in slow white clouds while the sharp smell of split pine fills the cold air. Today, like nearly every day, revolves around firewood. A historically well-documented fact of colonial winter life is that families consumed enormous quantities of wood for heating and cooking. In heavily forested regions like New England, settlers spent much of autumn and winter cutting, hauling, splitting, stacking, and rationing timber simply to stay alive through prolonged cold seasons. The father hands you a rough iron axe with a wooden handle polished smooth from years of use. It feels heavier than expected. Cold metal bites instantly against your gloves. Nearby, boys no older than 10 drag branches through snow toward the splitting block. Colonial childhood tends to involve significantly more manual labour and dramatically fewer cartoon blankets than modern life. The forest waits beyond the settlement edge, dark and silent beneath towering pines. Snow hangs thick across branches overhead while animal tracks cross narrow paths between the trees. The deeper you walk into the woods, the quieter the colony becomes behind you until only the crunch of boots and distant chopping remain. Thunk, thunk, thunk. Axes echo strangely through frozen air. You pause beside a fallen tree while the scent of fresh sap rises from pale, exposed wood. The cold here feels sharper beneath the forest canopy. Shadows linger longer. Even the snow looks blue in certain places. One settler kneels beside a log, adjusting numb fingers carefully near his mouth before returning to work. Frost gathers along the edges of his beard. Everyone moves steadily, conserving energy without fully stopping, because stopping means getting colder, and colder means danger arrives quietly. A lesser-known detail occasionally mentioned in colonial journals is that some families believed certain types of wood burned warmer or cleaner than others. Hickory, oak, and maple were prized whenever available, while green or poorly seasoned wood-filled cabins with thick smoke capable of turning an ordinary evening into a communal coughing event. You help drag cut branches toward a sled made from rough timber runners. The wood scrapes heavily across packed snow while your shoulders ache beneath the effort. Every log suddenly feels much heavier once uphill becomes involved. There are no shortcuts here. No delivery. Trucks. No thermostat waiting safely indoors. Only muscles, weather, and stubborn. The colony itself survives on rhythms shaped entirely by the seasons. During summer, settlers prepare endlessly for winter. During winter, they desperately hope summer preparation was enough. Sometimes it is not. Researchers widely agree that severe winters could quickly expose weak planning or poor harvests in colonial settlements. Families who failed to gather enough wood before heavy snowfall sometimes faced impossible choices involving food, travel, or exposure to dangerous cold. You glance towards the sky as clouds darken slightly overhead. Snow may return before evening. Nobody says it aloud, but everyone notices weather constantly. Colonists read wind shifts and cloud shapes the way sailors study tides. One older man pauses beside the sled and quietly rubs his hands near his chest. His fingertips appear pale and stiff. Frostbite remains common during harsh winters, especially for settlers working outdoors for long hours with damp gloves or worn boots. There is no dramatic music announcing danger. Cold simply keeps taking little pieces from you. Toes first. Fingers next. Sleep after that. You begin hauling the loaded sled back toward the settlement. The runners scrape loudly across frozen ground while nearby trees creak faintly in the wind. Pine needles release sharp, clean scents whenever branches snap beneath passing boots. At the colony edge, smoke rises steadily from chimneys into the grey afternoon sky. The smell reaches you before the warmth does. Wood smoke has become strangely comforting now. Familiar, almost protective. Inside one cabin, a woman kneels beside the hearth feeding narrow strips of bark beneath a struggling flame. The room looks dim despite daylight because smoke stains the windows and rafters alike. You feel immediate relief stepping indoors even though the warmth remains uneven and imperfect. A child sleeps wrapped in blankets beside the fire with one hand stretched toward the heat. Nearby, damp mittens hang from a cord overhead, dripping slowly onto the floorboards. The fire pops sharply. Everyone looks up instinctively. A curious fringe belief recorded in parts of colonial New England claimed that certain hearth fires behave differently before storms or deaths within the household. Some settlers watched flames closely for strange crackling patterns or sudden smoke bursts, which honestly sounds like the human brain trying very hard to assign meaning to being cold and exhausted constantly. You stack fresh timber carefully beside the hearth. The family studies the pile with visible relief. Wood means another night survived, another morning with hot food, another chance to wake without frost forming directly on your blanket. And yet the pile already looks too small. That is the trick winter plays on everyone. No amount ever feels sufficient. Scholars continue debating how much deforestation around early colonial settlements accelerated due to relentless timber demands for heating and construction. Some historians argue nearby forests disappeared surprisingly quickly around expanding villages, forcing families to travel farther each year for suitable firewood. Evening arrives early beneath thickening clouds. Darkness settles softly across the settlement while snow begins drifting down again in thin, swirling sheets. The sound changes once more, softer footsteps, quieter voices, the entire world muffled beneath falling snow. Inside the cabin, supper cooks slowly over the fire. The stew smells faintly of onions and salted meat while shadows flicker warmly across rough wooden walls. Your boots steam gently near the hearth. Outside, wind rattles against the roof. Inside, flames dance carefully through stacked logs gathered from frozen forests earlier today. The labour never truly ends. Tomorrow more wood will be needed, and the day after that, and the day after that, because winter keeps eating, and the fire must keep answering. By late January, the settlement begins thinking about food almost constantly. Not in the pleasant modern sense where you casually wonder whether to order soup or sandwiches while standing safely inside a heated kitchen. No. This is quieter than that, sharper. Every meal carries arithmetic hidden beneath it. How much flour remains? How many salted fish still hang in storage? Whether the barrel of oats will survive another month. You stand inside the cabin while weak daylight filters through smoke-stained windows and the smell of boiling cabbage drifts heavily through the room. The pot hanging over the hearth contains supper, though calling it exciting would require a level of imagination usually reserved for poetry or severe hunger. Mostly severe hunger. A great many colonial families relied during winter on preserved foods prepared months earlier. Salted pork, dried peas, smoked fish, root vegetables, hard bread, and coarse grains formed the backbone of cold-season diets across much of New England. Fresh produce became scarce quickly once frost settled across the region. You crouch beside a storage chest while the mother lifts its heavy lid carefully. Inside rests the colony's true treasure. Not gold, not silver, turnips, also onions, shriveled apples, and sacks of meal, but the turnips feel especially victorious somehow. The air inside the chest smells earthy and damp. Cold root vegetables carry the scent of soil long after harvest. Nearby, strips of smoked meat hang from ceiling beams darkened by years of firelight and soot. Nothing about winter eating feels pure. Every crumb has already survived considerable effort. Outside, snow falls in slow drifting sheets while the wind rattles faintly against the cabin walls. Someone enters carrying a frozen rabbit caught earlier that morning in a snare beyond the forest edge. The animal looks small. Everyone notices immediately how small. Still, meat is meat. You help scrape ice from a water bucket beside the door while conversation circles quietly around supplies. One family nearby lost several hens during the last storm. Another traded precious candles for extra grain 2 weeks ago. A fishing boat has not returned yet from the coast. People speak carefully when discussing food shortages. Too much honesty sounds dangerously close to fear. An overlooked but fascinating detail from colonial kitchens is that some settlers flavoured otherwise bland winter meals with imported spices whenever they could afford them. Tiny amounts of nutmeg, cinnamon, or cloves occasionally appeared even in isolated settlements because Atlantic trade networks carried luxury goods farther than many people realise. Imagine nearly freezing to death while your porridge contains fashionable cinnamon. History loves strange contrasts. You sit near the fire while bread bakes slowly beside the hearth. The smell transforms the room instantly. Warm grain, smoke, yeast, and ash mingle together into something deeply comforting. Even tired children look more awake once bread enters the conversation. The loaf itself emerges dense and dark with a thick crust hard enough to qualify as construction material. Colonial bread often relied on mixed grains like rye or cornmeal rather than fine white flour, especially during difficult winters. Still warm though. Still filling. That matters more. Some surviving household records suggest families occasionally stretched meals with surprisingly creative substitutions during harsh seasons. Ground acorns, chestnuts, and even certain bark flowers appeared in emergency situations when conventional grain supplies weakened dangerously. You chew slowly beside the fire while snow thickens outside the windows. The room glows softly beneath candlelight now. Shadows shift across hanging herbs and stacked bowls while steam rises from damp coats drying overhead. Everything smells slightly edible in winter cabins. Smoke, stew, old onions, maybe the candle wax if times become dramatic enough. You notice how carefully leftovers are handled after supper. Bones are saved for broth, crumbs are gathered from the table. Nothing disappears casually into waste because a replacement may not arrive until spring ships reach the colony again. Even spoiled food presents difficult choices. A point often emphasized by social historians is that winter starvation did not always appear as sudden collapse. More commonly, families experienced gradual weakening through smaller portions, poor nutrition, illness, and exhaustion building slowly across months of inadequate food. The father slices thin portions from smoked pork while two children watch with painful concentration. Nobody receives large servings. Even the adults eat cautiously. One girl licks grease from her fingers afterward with almost ceremonial seriousness. Honestly understandable. Across the settlement, cooking smells drift upward through chimney smoke into the freezing evening air. Fish stew from one cabin, roasted onions from another. Somewhere nearby, someone burns supper badly enough for the entire neighbourhood to notice. That smell travels impressively fast. A strange little anecdote preserved in some colonial writings mentions people occasionally judging neighbours by the smell of their chimneys during winter. Richer homes might produce scents of roasting meat or imported spices, while poorer cabins often smelled primarily of boiled grains and smoke. Entire social hierarchies apparently floated through the air above snowy rooftops. You step briefly outside carrying scraps toward a small storage shed. Night has fallen completely now. Snow reflects pale moonlight across the settlement paths while the cold tightens instantly around your face. The sky looks enormous, silent. The stars burn with the terrifying clarity above the frozen world, and beneath them, tiny clusters of human beings sit beside fires hoping their supplies last long enough to see another thaw. Some researchers continue disagreeing about how frequently colonial communities experienced true famine conditions during late 17th century winters. Certain accounts describe devastating shortages, while others suggest many settlements survived through careful rationing, trade, hunting, and mutual aid between neighbouring households. Probably both happen. Winter rarely treats every family equally. Back inside, the youngest child has fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder while the fire settles lower into glowing coals. Someone quietly mends a torn glove near candlelight. Another person stirs tomorrow's porridge starter, slowly with a wooden spoon. The cabin creaks gently in the wind. Your stomach feels full enough for tonight, though not comfortably full. Colonial winter meals rarely leave that luxurious modern feeling of eating too much while regretting dessert choices. Instead, there is simply relief. Enough for one more evening, enough to sleep, enough to wake tomorrow and continue again. Outside, snow keeps falling over the settlement roofs, over the buried fences, over the dark forests stretching endlessly beyond the colony. And somewhere beneath all that snow, spring waits very patiently. The cold finds every exposed inch of you eventually. It slips beneath collars, creeps through boot seams, settles into damp gloves, and remains there with impressive dedication. By February, you begin understanding that colonial winter survival depends less on staying comfortably warm and more on remaining slightly less miserable than the weather intends. You wake before sunrise while frost clings to the inside edges of the cabin walls in delicate white patterns. The fire has weakened overnight again. Your nose feels cold. One foot somehow escaped the blanket during sleep and now resembles a small frozen artifact recovered from an archaeological dig. Nearby, someone coughs softly beneath layers of wool. The room smells of smoke, damp cloth, and wet leather slowly drying beside the hearth. You sit upright carefully and begin the complicated process of getting dressed, which in 1692 resembles preparing for battle against invisible ice demons. First the linen shirt, stiff and chilly from yesterday's sweat drying into the fabric, then wool stockings pulled carefully over aching legs, then heavier layers, petticoats for women, breeches for men, shawls, cloaks, caps, mittens, scarves. Everything scratches. Everything bunches awkwardly. Everything still somehow feels insufficient. Evidence from surviving colonial inventories shows that Wool formed the backbone of winter clothing throughout New England settlements because it retained warmth even when damp. Linen garments were common underneath, while fur, leather, and layered fabrics helped settlers endure prolonged exposure to bitter cold. You pull a knitted cap low across your ears while stepping closer to the fire. Heat brushes one side of your face while the other remains cold enough to reconsider all life choices leading here. Across the cabin, the mother helps a child wrap strips of cloth around his hands beneath oversized mittens. His fingers already look pink and raw from yesterday's wood gathering. Winter skin cracks constantly in this climate, knuckles split, lips dry, faces chap red beneath icy wind. Nobody owns miracle moisturizer. Only animal fat and determination. A surprisingly odd custom mentioned in some colonial writings involves people sleeping in layers of daytime clothing rather than changing fully for bed during severe cold spells. Not exactly glamorous bedtime fashion, but when temperatures plunge far below freezing, dignity quietly packs its bags and leaves town. Outside, pale morning light spreads across deep snowdrifts surrounding the settlement. Wind lifts powdery snow into twisting shapes between cabins while smoke rises lazily from chimney tops. You step outdoors carefully, immediately feeling cold clamp around your ankles through stiff leather boots. The boots are heavy and imperfect things. Snow melts into them, then freezes, then melts again. Colonial feet endure astonishing hardship. You walk toward the well carrying a wooden bucket while your breath curls white through the air. Every movement produces layered sounds beneath winter clothing, wool rubbing against wool, leather creaking, snow crunching sharply underfoot. Nearby, a woman shakes frozen laundry from a line. The garments hang stiff as wooden boards. They clatter softly together in the wind like strange fabric wind chimes announcing historical discomfort. A detail often overlooked in popular images of colonial life is just how damp winter clothing frequently became. Snow, sweat, melting ice, and poor drying conditions meant settlers often spent days wearing heavy garments that never fully dried, increasing risks of illness and frostbite. You flex numb fingers against the bucket handle while staring briefly toward the forest edge. Pine trees sway darkly beneath grey skies. Somewhere distant, an axe echoes faintly again. Always chopping wood, always carrying something, always repairing. The colony survives through endless physical effort wrapped in wool. Back inside the cabin, the younger children sit close beside the hearth while one older girl carefully darns stockings near weak daylight. The room glows gold against the cold blue world outside. Steam rises from a kettle. Damp mittens line the wall beside drying herbs and hanging cloaks. Everything feels crowded but purposeful. No empty space exists here. A curious little note recorded by one traveller in colonial New England claimed that certain settlers wore layered stockings of different textures because rougher outer wool helped trap heat, while softer inner layers prevented blistering. Whether this strategy truly worked or simply represented desperate experimentation by freezing people remains difficult to say. Breakfast arrives in thick wooden bowls carried carefully from the hearth. Porridge again, warm at least. You cradle the bowl with both hands, partly for comfort and partly because your fingers still ache from outside. Warm food becomes emotional support during winter. You begin appreciating steam itself. One widely acknowledged challenge of colonial clothing involved limited opportunities for proper washing during severe cold weather. Laundering required hauling water, heating enormous quantities over fires, scrubbing by hand, and drying garments in freezing air. As a result, winter wardrobes often carried lingering smells of smoke, sweat, damp wool, and wood ash. Honestly, after enough weeks, everyone smells vaguely like a campfire that developed anxiety. You glance toward the doorway as another gust rattles the cabin walls. Snow sneaks through tiny cracks beneath the frame and melts slowly onto the floorboards. Even the house seems tired. A boy near the hearth removes one boot and grimaces immediately. The wool stocking underneath reveals angry red skin along several toes, Frostnip, perhaps, maybe worse. The adults study it quietly before moving him closer to the fire. No panic, just weary familiarity. Cold injuries happen often here. Researchers continue examining how effectively colonial winter clothing actually protected settlers during extreme weather, compared with indigenous winter garments made from expertly prepared animal hides and furs. Some evidence suggests European-style clothing often performed poorly in harsh North American conditions until colonists gradually adapted local techniques and materials. The fire crackles softly while snow taps against the windows in dry little bursts. Outside, the world remains endless shades of white, grey, and dark pine green. Inside, candlelight flickers across patched sleeves and worn boots resting beside the hearth. Every garment tells a story of repair, elbows reinforced, mittens restitched, stockings patched repeatedly until almost more patch than stocking. Nothing gets discarded casually. Winter punishes waste very efficiently. By evening, your outer cloak smells heavily of smoke after standing too close to the fire all day. Your boots remain damp despite hours near the hearth. Your shoulders ache beneath the weight of layered fabric and physical exhaustion. And yet, when darkness settles over the colony again, when wind begins howling faintly beyond the walls and frost creeps silently across the windows, those same rough wool blankets suddenly feel precious, heavy, warm, protective. You wrap yourself tightly inside them while the fire glows low beside the sleeping cabin. Outside, the storm keeps searching for weaknesses. Inside, the layers hold. For tonight, at least. Night in the colony feels different from daytime winter. During daylight hours, people move constantly, chopping, hauling, cooking, sawing, mending, animals carrying water. Exhaustion keeps fear busy, but after sunset, when the fires burn lower and the forest disappears into darkness beyond the cabin walls, your imagination suddenly finds free time. And that turns out to be unfortunate. You lie awake beneath wool blankets while wind brushes softly across the roof overhead. The cabin has gone mostly quiet now except for slow breathing, occasional coughs, and the gentle shifting crackle of dying firewood. Outside, the world sounds enormous. A familiar truth about colonial settlements is that artificial light remained extremely limited after dark. Once candles burned low and hearthfires weakened, families existed within deep natural darkness interrupted only by moonlight, storms, and scattered lantern glow from neighbouring homes. You stare toward the dim outline of the doorway, while pale orange embers pulse faintly across the room. Every sound becomes sharper at night. The creak of timber, snow slipping from the roof, someone turning over in sleep nearby. Then, somewhere beyond the settlement, a long-distant howl drifts through the frozen air. The sound lingers, thin, wild, uncomfortably confident. A child beneath the blanket shifts slightly closer to his mother without fully waking. Nobody speaks. Wolves remain a known presence beyond the colony edge, especially during hard winters when food grows scarce in the forests. You probably tell yourself it sounds farther away than it actually does. That seems emotionally healthy. The fire snaps suddenly beside the hearth and showers tiny sparks upward. Smoke curls lazily toward the rafters carrying the familiar scent of charred pine and old ash. Your eyes sting faintly from it, but nobody complains much anymore. Smoke simply belongs to indoor life now. An intriguing detail preserved in several colonial accounts suggests some settlers hung extra cloth or animal hides along interior walls during winter nights to reduce drafts and soften outside sounds. Whether it improved warmth significantly remains uncertain, though psychologically it probably helped people feel less exposed to the darkness beyond the cabin. Outside again comes another sound. Not wolves this time. Crack! A deep splitting noise echoes through the forest somewhere beyond sight. Perhaps a tree limb breaking beneath heavy ice. Perhaps an entire frozen trunk snapping in the cold. The The noise rolls across the snowfields like distant thunder. You stop breathing for half a second. Winter forests make alarming sounds at night. The cold tightens wood and wildflowers until trees fracture explosively without warning. Ice shifts across rivers with low groaning noises that resemble enormous creatures moving beneath the surface. Wind whistles through pines in tones eerily close to whispered voices if you happen to be tired, freezing, and already suspicious of the wilderness, which most colonists absolutely are. A number of first-hand descriptions from 17th century New England mention how isolated settlements often felt emotionally vulnerable during winter darkness. Long nights, limited communication, harsh weather, and unfamiliar wilderness created constant undercurrents of anxiety, even in otherwise stable communities. You understand immediately. The cabin feels small tonight. Safe, perhaps, but very small. The wind grows stronger outside. Snow rattles against the walls in dry, sweeping bursts while smoke pushes unevenly through the chimney. One man rises quietly from his blankets to check the fire again. Nobody questions it. Night fires require constant attention, because letting them die completely means waking inside a freezing cabin before dawn. He adds another log carefully. The flames brighten. Warm orange light flickers across tired faces before settling lower again. A peculiar superstition recorded in parts of colonial New England claimed that hearing 3 knocks outside after midnight could signal approaching death or misfortune. In reality, it was probably loose shutters, tree branches, or exhausted people terrifying themselves creatively through sleep deprivation. Still, you can imagine how quickly imaginations expanded during long winter nights. You pull the blanket tighter beneath your chin while listening. There, another sound. Closer this time. Not a howl, more like scratching. Slow dragging noises near the outer wall. Every muscle suddenly becomes very interested in this information. The father lifts his head slightly from across the room. Silence spreads through the cabin, except for the scratching continuing faintly outside. Then comes a soft thump against the wall. You wait. Another thump. Thump. And finally a muttered voice from outside, followed by the unmistakable snort of a goat. Relief moves quietly through the room. Apparently one of the animals escaped its shelter again and decided midnight wandering seemed like a perfectly reasonable life choice. Honestly, the goat probably just wanted warmer company. A recurring challenge in colonial settlements involved livestock moving unpredictably during winter storms. Animals frequently broke fences, damaged stored supplies, or wandered dangerously close to homes searching for warmth and food. The scratching fades gradually as someone outside leads the animal away through deep snow. Soon the only remaining sounds are wind, breathing, and distant shifting trees beyond the settlement. You try sleeping again. For a while it works. Then the baby starts crying, not loudly at first, just tired little whimpers near the hearth. The mother wakes immediately, wrapping the child closer inside the blankets while whispering softly in the darkness. Her voice blends gently with the crackling fire and the storm outside. The cabin smells warmer now, smoke, wool, human breath trapped beneath heavy blankets, faint traces of stew lingering from supper earlier that evening. Strange how comforting all of it becomes. Some modern historians continue discussing how much psychological strain colonial winters placed upon isolated families, especially during seasons of severe storms or food shortages. Diaries from the period occasionally reveal loneliness, anxiety, insomnia, and religious fear shaped by long stretches of confinement and uncertainty. You can feel it in the silence here. People survive physically, yes, but emotionally winter keeps pressing inward too. Hours pass slowly. The fire settles lower again to glowing coals. Moonlight appears faintly through the window covering as clouds shift outside. Snow reflects enough brightness across the landscape that the world beyond the cabin glows pale silver beneath the night sky. Beautiful from indoors. Very important distinction. At last, Sometime near dawn, the wind weakens, the trees quiet, the settlement rests beneath deep, untouched snow, while thin smoke rises gently from sleeping homes. You close your eyes again, listening to the final soft crackle from the hearth, and beyond the fragile walls of the cabin, the endless frozen wilderness waits patiently for morning. The cough begins softly enough that nobody reacts at first. Just one rough breath from across the cabin, while dawn light struggles through the frost-covered windows. Fires crackle, boots scrape against the floorboards, someone stirs porridge near the hearth. Winter routines continue as usual, because colonial families cannot afford to stop every time somebody sounds unwell. If they did, nothing would ever happen between November and March. You sit beside the fire, wrapping chilled fingers around a wooden cup while the coughing starts again. Longer this time. Wet, tired. The sort of cough that settles deep inside cramped cabins and quietly introduces itself to everyone else in the room. The man tries pretending it is nothing. Nobody believes him. People living through 17th century winters understood illness as a constant companion during cold months. Crowded homes, poor ventilation, limited nutrition, and exhausting physical labour created ideal conditions for fevers, respiratory sickness, and infection throughout many colonial settlements. The cabin smells heavier today somehow. Smoke still drifts near the rafters, but beneath it lingers another scent now. Sweat, damp blankets, human sickness warming slowly beside the fire. You glance toward the sick man sitting near the wall, wrapped tightly in wool. His face appears flushed despite the cold room. Every few minutes he presses a cloth against his mouth before staring silently into the flames. Nobody panic is immediate. Colonial illness often arrives gradually. One cough, then another. Then 3 people feel tired by the following morning. Outside, snow falls steadily across the settlement roofs, while icy wind pushes through gaps around the doorway. A woman enters, carrying heated water from the hearth, and kneels beside the man without speaking much. Her movements feel practiced. Too practiced. A number of surviving diaries from New England mention how entire households sometimes became sick simultaneously during winter, forcing neighbours to exchange food, firewood, and caregiving duties simply to keep families alive until spring conditions improved. You notice the children being kept slightly farther from the sick corner of the room now. Not formally, nobody announces it aloud, but bodies shift subtly. Sleeping blankets get rearranged. Shared cups disappear quietly from circulation. People may not understand germs yet, but experience teaches patterns. The man coughs again, longer, hard enough that everyone pauses briefly. Then life continues because supper still requires cooking and wood still requires hauling regardless of anyone's lungs. One curious remedy appearing in shattered colonial records involved placing heated onions or garlic near sickbeds because some believe strong-smelling foods helped cleanse unhealthy air. Whether this improved actual illness remains doubtful, though the cabin probably smelled dramatically more interesting afterward. By afternoon, word spreads through neighbouring homes that sickness has appeared again. Not unusual, just unwelcome. You step outside carrying ashes toward the snowbank while smoke drifts low beneath the grey scum. Nearby cabins look peaceful from a distance, chimneys rising subtly into falling snow, children dragging sleds across packed paths, someone chopping frozen timber near the edge of the woods. But inside several homes, coughing echoes through the long winter evenings. A harsh reality of colonial medicine was that treatments often depended more upon tradition, religion, household knowledge, and inherited folk practices than reliable scientific understanding. Physicians remained scarce in many settlements, especially during severe weather when travel became dangerous or impossible. Back indoors, the sick man now sleeps uneasily beside the hearth while another woman crushes herbs carefully using a wooden spoon. The smell reaches you immediately. Mint, vinegar, something bitter underneath. The mixture steams faintly in a clay cup before being carried toward the bedside. You're not entirely convinced this will solve pneumonia. Still, doing something feels emotionally preferable to doing nothing. The fire pops sharply while snow brushes softly against the windows. One child asks quietly whether the illness came from the cold air outside. Another wonders if bad water caused it. The adults answer vaguely because honestly, nobody truly knows. Not yet. One especially strange treatment mentioned by travellers in colonial America involved tying warm animal fat or herbal poultices directly against the chest during severe coughs. Imagine trying to recover from fever while smelling faintly like seasoned cooking ingredients. History rarely prioritizes dignity. Evening settles slowly across the colony. Candlelight flickers through smoke haze while exhausted faces glow orange beside the hearth. The sick man wakes briefly, drinks water with trembling hands, then sinks back beneath blankets. His breathing sounds shallow now. The room grows quieter around him. Several modern historians remain uncertain how accurately colonial death records captured ordinary winter illnesses, especially in smaller settlements where causes of death often went undocumented or were interpreted through religious language rather than medical observation. You can feel the uncertainty here tonight. Nobody knows whether this sickness will pass in a few days or spread through half the settlement before the snow melts. That ignorance weighs heavily. Outside, darkness closes around the colony again. Wind slides through the trees beyond the cabins while dogs bark somewhere near the frozen shoreline. The entire world feels cold and distant beneath thick cloud cover. Inside, the firelight grows softer. A woman dips cloth into warm water and presses it gently against the sick man's forehead. Another adds fresh wood to the hearth. Someone whispers a prayer near the doorway. No grand speeches, no dramatic declarations. Just ordinary people trying to protect one another from winter and exhaustion and illness all at once. The smell of herbs thickens as steam rises beside the fire. The cabin feels overheated near the hearth, yet freezing only a few feet away. You shift beneath your blanket, searching again for warmth that never fully arrives. Another cough breaks the silence, then another from somewhere outside. Different cabin this time. You notice everyone hears it. Researchers studying colonial communities often point out that fear itself spread rapidly during harsh winters. Illness carried emotional weight beyond physical danger because one sick family member could threaten labour, food gathering, childcare, and survival for entire households. And survival already hangs by a thread during February. The fire burns lower. Snow keeps falling. The sick man finally drifts into deeper sleep while the others sit silently around the fading warmth, listening to the storm outside and the fragile breathing within the room. You realise then that winter in 1692 does not merely test strength. It tests endurance, patience, hope, and sometimes lungs already tired from breathing smoke 6 months straight. The cabin settles softly into darkness while the colony waits uneasily for morning. Before sunrise, while most of the colony still sleeps beneath heavy blankets and fading embers, one person is already awake. She moves quietly through the darkness beside the hearth, wrapping a shawl tighter across her shoulders while cold floorboards creak softly beneath tired feet. Outside, the sky remains black. Wind brushes faintly against the cabin walls. Frost clings to the corners of the windows like pale lace. But the work begins anyway. You watch her kneel before the pier, coaxing weak coals back toward life with practiced patience. A handful of kindling, a careful breath, tiny orange sparks waking beneath grey ash. Soon the flames rise again, small at first. Then, stronger, the room slowly exhales warmth. Much of colonial household survival depended upon the labour of women whose daily responsibilities stretched from before dawn until late evening. Cooking, washing, repairing clothing, caring for children, tending the sick, preserving food, and managing household supplies formed an endless cycle of physically demanding work, especially during winter. She barely pauses before moving to the next task. Water must be heated, breakfast prepared, wet clothing checked near the pipes, Children awakened. Ashes carried outside. The cabin itself seems to depend upon her motion. You sit wrapped in blankets while the smell of smoke and simmering oats begins filling the room again. Somewhere outside, a rooster attempts optimism despite the freezing darkness. The sound feels emotionally ambitious under the circumstances. The woman steps toward a wooden table and begins kneading coarse dough beneath dim candlelight. Her fingers move automatically despite cracked skin along the knuckles. Winter hands rarely heal properly here. They split open, roughen, then continue working anyway. No lotions. No warm spa towels. Just flour and stubbornness. One detail appearing frequently in household records from colonial New England is the enormous amount of textile labour performed inside homes. Women spun thread, patched garments, repaired blankets, and produced clothing by hand during long winter evenings, while sitting close to precious firelight. You notice a basket overflowing with worn stockings beside the hearth. Some contain careful patches geared over older patches beneath them. Others wait for missing buttons or repaired seams. Nothing gets discarded unless absolutely destroyed. Fabric means labour. Labour means time. Time means survival. The youngest child wakes crying softly from the cold while another struggles into stiff wool clothing near the sleeping corner. Their mother moves between them and the cooking fire without ever fully stopping. One hand stirs porridge, while the other adjusts blankets around the sick man still resting near the wall. Her own breakfast waits untouched. Naturally, a lesser-known custom from some colonial communities involved women carrying heated stones wrapped in cloth beneath aprons or shawls while working outdoors during extreme cold. Whether it worked brilliantly or simply resulted in occasional accidental burns probably depended heavily on the quality of the stone selection. The cabin grows busier as daylight slowly appears through the frosted windows. Children argue sleepily over mittens. Someone spills water beside the hearth. A dog shakes snow across the floor after pushing through the doorway. Nobody stops moving long enough to become fully warm. That is the secret rhythm of winter. Keep moving, keep carrying, keep surviving. Writers from the 17th century occasionally remarked upon how domestic work increased dramatically during colder months because every ordinary task became more difficult. Water froze, laundry dried slowly, fires required constant maintenance, cooking consumed large amounts of fuel and preparation time. You follow the woman outside as pale dawn spreads across the snowy settlement. She carries 2 wooden buckets balanced carefully against stiff arms while icy wind pushes loose strands of hair across her face. The well path has become polished slick from repeated footsteps. Nearby, another woman beats frozen blankets against a fence post while steam rises from her breath in thick white clouds. Across the settlement, smoke lifts from dozens of chimneys into the cold morning air. The colony survives because these routines repeat endlessly. Not gloriously, not dramatically, just endlessly. You reach the well where ice crusts thick around the wooden rim. Water sloshes darkly below after someone breaks the frozen surface apart with an iron tool. The sound echoes sharply through the morning stillness. Every bucket hauled here weighs heavily. Every trip matters. A strange but genuine note from one traveller described colonial women occasionally warming their feet directly against sleepy livestock inside barns before beginning morning chores. Frankly, after enough freezing dawns, a cooperative goat probably starts looking like excellent central heating. Back inside the cabin, breakfast finally reaches the table. Thin porridge again, though slightly richer today with a few dried apples added to the pot. The smell turns sweeter instantly. Children eat quickly, adults eat carefully. The woman mostly eats standing up between tasks. Some modern scholars suggest the physical demands placed upon colonial women during winter rivaled or exceeded many forms of traditionally recognized labor. Beyond household duties, women frequently hauled water, managed animals, processed food supplies, and participated directly in seasonal survival work. And still much of it went unnoticed because it happened indoors. Quietly. Daily. You sit near the fire while she washes wooden bowls in heated water already turning cloudy from ash and grease. Steam curls upward around tired hands reddened by heat and cold together. Outside, Solborgen falling again. Tiny flakes drifting past the windows. Beautiful if viewed briefly from indoors. Less beautiful when hauling water through it for the 5th time that day. The sick man wakes coughing near the hearth while the woman immediately crosses the room carrying warm broth toward him. No hesitation, no complaint. Just another task added silently to the endless list winter already demands. You begin realizing something important here. The colony's survival does not rest solely on strong walls or stocked food barrels or firewood piles. It rests on repetition, on people waking every morning and continuing despite exhaustion, especially the women. Evening arrives slowly beneath thick cloud cover. Candlelight flickers across the cabin while sewing needles flash softly beside the fire. The woman finally sits for a moment repairing torn mittens while children drift towards sleep around her. Her shoulders sag slightly now that the room has quieted. The fire glows low. Wind brushes softly against the roof. Outside, winter continues pressing against the colony from every direction. Inside, one exhausted woman threads another needle beneath the warm orange light and prepares for tomorrow to begin again before dawn. Children in the colony learn winter quickly. Not through lectures or gentle seasonal crafts involving decorative pine cones and cheerful music. No, winter teaches through frozen fingers, heavy buckets, slippery paths, and adults constantly saying things like, "Put your cap back on before your ears fall off." Which honestly feels slightly exaggerated, probably. You wake to the sound of muffled laughter near the hearth while weak morning sunlight glows pale through the frosted windows. The younger children have already discovered entertainment by sliding across the floorboards in oversized wool stockings while waiting for breakfast. One crashes gently into a stool, another immediately blames someone else. Colonial childhood continues surprisingly normally beneath extreme weather. A consistent theme appearing in accounts of early New England settlements is that children contributed meaningful labour from a young age. Boys and girls hauled water, gathered kindling, cared for animals, assisted with cooking, and performed countless small tasks essential to household survival during winter months. The older daughter hands you a wooden pail and gestures toward the well outside. Apparently even sleepy historical observers are not exempt from chores. You pull your cloak tighter before stepping outdoors into the sharp cold air. Snow squeaks beneath your boots while smoke rises from nearby chimneys in twisting grey ribbons. Several children move between cabins already working despite the early hour. One boy drags a sled piled with branches nearly larger than himself. Another scatters feed near a chicken enclosure while muttering dramatically about frostbite. A little girl carefully carries folded laundry indoors before fresh snow reaches the fabric again. Nobody here remains idle long. At the well, the younger children treat the icy path like both a workplace and accidental playground. One nearly slips while balancing a bucket, regains control at the last second, then looks deeply proud of surviving his own terrible decision. Reasonably so. Some diary fragments from colonial families reveal that winter games still existed despite harsh conditions. Children built snow figures, slid across frozen ponds, threw snowballs, and invented rough outdoor games whenever chores and weather allowed brief moments of freedom. You can understand why even exhausted children eventually need to act ridiculous for a while. Back inside the cabin, breakfast smells of oats and weak molasses. The children gather near the fire, rubbing stiff hands together, while steam rises from damp mittens hanging overhead. One small boy sits directly beside the hearth, attempting to warm both front and back simultaneously by rotating slowly like nervous bread dough. Honestly, clever boy. A curious observation from one 17th century visitor noted that colonial children often wore miniature versions of adult clothing, rather than specialized garments designed specifically for childhood. Tiny wool coats, stiff caps, Heavy stockings and serious little boots apparently created entire generations of uncomfortable miniature adults. The youngest girl coughs lightly while her mother wraps another layer around her shoulders. Illness spreads easily among children during winter because small bodies lose heat faster, and crowded cabins allow sickness to move quietly from one bedroll to another. Still, children adapt astonishingly well. They complain loudly, then continue anyway. A number of researchers studying colonial family life emphasize how childhood during this period blended work and play together almost constantly. Tasks considered exhausting for modern children often existed alongside ordinary moments of curiosity, imagination, and humour within daily settlement life. You see it everywhere. One boy feeds goats while pretending to command an army. Another uses icicles as the imaginary swords until an adult confiscates them for obvious reasons. Two sisters fold blankets together while whispering secrets beside the fire. Winter hardship exists, certainly, but so does ordinary childhood. Outside Lowell later that afternoon, several children gather near the edge of the settlement where snowdrifts rise high beside a fence line. Their laughter drifts clearly through the cold air while they tumble down the slope repeatedly in what appears to be a highly disorganized but enthusiastic sledding operation involving wooden boards and poor judgment. One child loses a mitten halfway down. Nobody notices until afterward. Panic follows immediately. Mitten recovery during colonial winter apparently qualifies as an emergency event. You help search through the snow while icy wind brushes across reddened cheeks and watering eyes. Eventually the mitten appears half buried beneath powder near a tree stump. The child clutches it with visible relief. Perfectly understandable. Losing clothing in this weather carries real danger. One unusual little detail preserved in some New England writings mentions children warming frozen hands beneath chickens, or inside pockets filled with warm grain after outdoor chores. Not exactly luxury heating technology, but probably comforting in an oddly feathery way. As evening approaches, the younger children grow quieter. Winter darkness arrives early again, painting the snowy settlement blue beneath the fading sky. Smoke thickens above the rooftops while families retreat indoors carrying tools, buckets, and tired limbs with them. Inside the cabin, candlelight flickers warmly across flushed faces and drying stockings. The children sit close beside the hearth while an older woman tells a story involving storms, wolves, and a deeply questionable hunting decision made by someone's cousin years earlier. The younger listeners stare wide-eyed. You suspect the details improve dramatically with each retelling. Accounts from the period occasionally suggest storytelling played an important role during long winter nights, especially for children confined indoors by storms or dangerous cold. Folk tales of Bible stories, family memories, and exaggerated survival tales helped pass time beside dim fires while wind shook the cabins outside. The youngest boy eventually falls asleep curled beside the dog near the hearth. One girl continues sewing tiny uneven stitches into a torn sleeve while fighting exhaustion. Another quietly traces shapes into frost gathered along the window frame. Children in 1692 carry responsibilities early, but they also carry wonder, even here, even now. The fire settles lower while snow begins falling again outside the cabin. Soft flakes drift past the windows into deepening darkness beyond the colony paths. Inside, tired voices soften, blankets rustle, someone yawns loudly enough to make everyone else yawn too. And for a few quiet moments before sleep fully arrives, the children rest safely beside the fire while winter circles endlessly beyond the walls. Sunday morning arrives colder than the others. You notice it immediately while stepping outside before dawn beneath a sky the colour of iron. Snow creaks sharply under your boots. Wind moves across the settlement in long, bitter currents that slip through every layer of wool no matter how tightly you wrap yourself. And still people prepare for church. Not casually either. Colonial New England treats church attendance with the seriousness of survival itself, which, for many settlers, it probably is. The meeting house stands near the centre of the colony, dark against the snowy landscape while thin smoke rises from surrounding cabins. Families emerge slowly into the freezing morning carrying lanterns, prayer books, blankets, and exhausted children bundled almost beyond recognition. One boy resembles a very determined pile of scarves. You join the slow procession, moving through the snow-covered paths. Breath clouds drift upward from dozens of mouths, while the only sounds are boots crunching across ice and the distant groaning of trees bending in the wind. Religious life shaped nearly every aspect of many colonial communities during the late 17th century. Church gatherings provided not only worship but also social structure, public announcements, moral guidance, and emotional reassurance during difficult winters marked by isolation and uncertainty. The meeting house itself looks plain from the outside. Simple timber walls, small windows, steep roof carrying thick snow. No grand stained glass or towering cathedral bells here. Puritan architecture generally favours seriousness over decorative drama. The building seems designed less for comfort than for endurance, much like everyone attending it. Inside, the air smells immediately familiar. Wet wool, smoke, cold wood slowly warming beneath human bodies. People settle onto narrow benches while stamping snow from boots and wrapping blankets tighter across their laps. The room remains chilly despite efforts to heat it. Tiny streams of frost still cling faintly near the windows. You sit beside a family whose youngest child has already fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder before the service even begins. Honestly, relatable. One small but memorable custom from certain New England congregations involved carrying heated stones or metal foot warmers into church during winter services. Worshippers sometimes wrapped hot objects in cloth beneath their feet because sermons could last astonishingly long in buildings that felt only marginally warmer than outdoors. The minister finally rises. His voice moves steadily through the cold room while candlelight flickers against dark wooden beams overhead. Outside, snow brushes softly against the walls. Inside, dozens of tired colonists listen carefully while trying not to lose circulation in their toes. You glance around the crowded meeting house, faces lined by exhaustion, red hands folded tightly together, children fighting sleep beneath heavy cloaks, and yet everyone came, even through snowstorms, even through sickness. Faith matters deeply here, not merely as belief, but as structure, as explanation, as emotional shelter against the wilderness pressing around the colony. Many surviving sermons from colonial New England reveal how harsh winters were often interpreted through spiritual language. Storms, illness, failed harvests, and freezing temperatures could be viewed as tests of faith, warnings from God or reminders of human weakness and dependence. The minister speaks about endurance today, about perseverance, about remaining steadfast through hardship. Outside, wind rattles the shutters with excellent dramatic timing. A child near the front sneezes loudly enough to interrupt the sermon for half a second. Several adults glance over with the same expression modern passengers use when someone coughs suspiciously on an airplane. Winter illness changes social dynamics quickly. The sermon continues, longer than your knees would prefer. Another fascinating little detail from the colonial church life is that some congregations assigned men called tithing men to monitor behaviour during services. Their duties reportedly included waking sleeping worshippers with long sticks or feathers. Imagine surviving brutal winter conditions only to get poked awake halfway through a freezing sermon about moral discipline. Outside the windows, pale daylight reflects across endless snowfields surrounding the settlement. Forests stand dark and motionless beneath low clouds. The colony itself appears tiny against the enormous winter landscape. Inside, voices rise softly together in prayer. You feel something calming in the rhythm of it all. Not necessarily certainty, but routine, shared endurance, the comfort of gathering together while storms continue outside. Researchers examining colonial social life often point out that winter gatherings carried additional importance because isolated households spent so much time confined indoors. Church services became opportunities to exchange news, maintain relationships, observe community health, and quietly assess which families appeared to be struggling most. You notice it now. People studying each other gently. Who looks thinner? Who seems sick? Whose boots need repair? Who arrived alone? After the service ends, the congregation lingers despite the cold. Small conversations form near the doorway while snow drifts steadily outside. One man discusses damaged fishing nets. Another quietly asks after a neighbour recovering from fever. Children immediately become louder the moment formal worship concludes. Remarkable recovery. A woman passes around small pieces of bread wrapped carefully in cloth while another family prepares for the long walk home through deepening snow. One elderly settler remarks that the weather feels worse than last year. Someone else insists every winter feels worse while you're currently inside it. Honestly, difficult to argue with. A few historians continue debating how emotionally comforting religion truly felt during the periods of severe colonial hardship versus how much it intensified fear through constant reminders of sin, judgment, and divine punishment. Personal writings from the period reveal both reassurance and anxiety woven deeply into everyday belief. You step back outside into sharp afternoon cold while churchgoers disperse slowly across the white landscape. Smoke rises from chimneys and thin blue trails beneath the darkening sky. Wind pushes loose snow across the paths in swirling patterns around your boots. The settlement looks quieter now, smaller somehow, but connected. Each cabin holds tired people returning from worship toward fires needing attention, meals needing preparation, children needing warmth. The ordinary routines begin again immediately. You walk carefully beside the others through the falling snow while distant church bells fade into the winter air behind you. And above the frozen colony, grey clouds continue gathering for another storm. By the middle of winter, the line between human space and animal space begins quietly dissolving. Not completely, of course. Nobody wakes cheerfully announcing plans to share a blanket with 3 goats and an irritated chicken. But survival changes standards. Warmth becomes more important than elegance remarkably fast. You discover this one freezing evening when the cabin door opens and a gust of snow swirls indoors alongside a deeply offended-looking goat. Apparently the animal is staying inside tonight. Nobody argues. The wind outside howls hard enough to shake the roof beams while snow lashes sideways across the settlement. Even from the doorway you can feel the storm's sharp cold reaching inward like icy fingers. The goat steps cautiously near the hearth, snorts once at everyone present, then settles beside stacked firewood with surprising confidence. Clearly this is not its first successful home invasion. Colonial households often kept animals extremely close during severe winters, especially smaller livestock such as chickens, goats, and pigs. Barns provided some shelter, but extreme cold, predators, and limited insulation sometimes pushed settlers to bring valuable animals nearer to living spaces. The cabin smells noticeably different now. Smoke still dominates naturally, but underneath comes damp fur and the unmistakable earthy scent of livestock trying very hard not to freeze. You sit beside the fire while chickens murmur softly from a corner enclosure built near the wall. Their feathers puff outward dramatically against the cold draft slipping beneath the door. Every few moments one gives an indignant cluck as if personally offended by winter itself. Honestly understandable. A small boy tosses scraps toward them while the family eats supper from wooden bowls balanced carefully on their knees. Steam rises from stew thickened with barley and onions. Outside, the storm continues hammering the settlement. Inside, humans and animals endure together. One traveller writing about New England winters remarked with obvious surprise upon entering homes where livestock noises blended directly into ordinary household life. Bleating goats, restless hens, barking dogs, and occasionally pigs formed part of the nightly soundtrack in some settlements. You can hear it clearly now, the soft rustle of feathers, the shifting scrape of hooves against floorboards, a dog sighing heavily near the fire, the occasional suspicious chewing noise from somewhere it absolutely should not be coming from. The warmth helps, though. Animals generate heat. Not elegant heat, perhaps, but effective. The youngest child has fallen asleep against the dog's side while snow rattles furiously across the roof overhead. Firelight flickers warmly through drifting smoke, turning the crowded cabin almost dreamlike despite the cramped conditions. You begin understanding how quickly colonial ideas about personal space collapse during hard weather. Space itself becomes flexible. A recurring pattern visible in colonial records is that winter storms frequently force settlers to improvise shelter arrangements for both people and animals. Families adapted constantly depending on weather severity, available firewood, damaged structures, or illness spreading through separate buildings. The goat near the hearth suddenly sneezes directly into the firelight. Everyone pauses. Then one child laughs hard enough to nearly spill supper. Honestly, fair reaction. A peculiar little custom mentioned in scattered accounts involved hanging dried herbs or evergreen branches near livestock during winter, because some settlers believed pleasant smells or protective plants helped keep animals healthy through severe cold. Whether the goats appreciated decorative rosemary remains undocumented. You step briefly outside to secure part of the fence rattling loose beneath heavy wind. The storm nearly steals your breath immediately. Snow drives sideways across the darkness. The sky has disappeared completely. Lantern light glows faintly from nearby cabins through swirling white air, while animal noises echo strangely from barns and sheds across the colony. You hurry back indoors before your face freezes into permanent regret. The warmth inside feels overwhelming after the storm outside. Your boots steam beside the fire. Wet snow melts slowly from your cloak onto the floorboards, while the goat watches with an expression suggesting you personally caused the weather. The chickens have settled quieter now. Children sleep. Adults continue working. One woman repairs harness straps near candlelight, while another carefully checks stored grain for signs of moisture or rodents. Winter never allows full rest. Researchers studying colonial food systems often note that protecting livestock through winter carried enormous importance because animals represented future labour, meat, milk, eggs, and trade value. Losing even a few creatures during severe weather could seriously weaken household survival chances later in the year. The dog lifts its head suddenly and growls softly toward the storm outside. Everyone listens. For a moment, only wind answers. Then, somewhere beyond the cabin, comes the sharp, cracking sound of wood splitting violently in the cold. Perhaps a branch collapsing beneath ice. Perhaps part of a nearby fence finally surrendering to the storm. Nobody rushes outside immediately. Nothing's worth freezing to death at midnight for a damaged fence. Probably. Another strange observation from colonial writings describes chickens occasionally roosting in loft spaces above sleeping families during the extreme weather. Imagine finally drifting asleep after a 14-hour workday, only to wake beneath falling feathers and judgmental poultry noises. The fire burns lower as evening deepens. Snow continues piling against the outer walls. Inside, the crowded warmth grows sleepy and heavy. The goat has fully committed to indoor life now, curled beside stacked timber with eyes half closed. One chicken perches calmly near the rafters while smoke drifts lazily overhead. You realize something quietly important in this moment. Colonial winter survival depends less on neat boundaries than cooperation. People sharing heat, animals sharing shelter, neighbours sharing supplies. Everyone adjusting expectations downward until survival itself becomes the main luxury. A few scholars remain uncertain how common indoor livestock arrangements truly were across different settlements because surviving descriptions vary widely depending on wealth, geography, and weather severity. But during brutal winters, practicality usually defeated pride eventually. Outside, the storm finally begins weakening sometime near midnight. Wind softens gradually around the cabin while snow settles into deep silent drifts beneath moonlight hidden behind clouds. Inside, the fire glows red and steady. The family sleeps scattered across blankets and benches. The dog twitches softly in dreams. The goat snores with astonishing confidence. And for one long freezing night in 1692, humans and animals survive the winter together beneath the same roof. Winter has a strange effect on neighbours. At first, the colony feels united against the cold. People share firewood, exchange food, help repair storm-damaged roofs, and check on sick families during heavy snowfalls. Survival encourages cooperation because everyone understands how quickly disaster spreads in freezing weather. But winter also traps people together for long stretches, and trapped people eventually begin noticing things. You step outside one pale grey morning, carrying a basket of mended clothing toward a nearby cabin. Snowdrifts rise shoulder-high along parts of the settlement now. Paths between homes have narrowed into icy corridors packed down by weeks of boots and sled runners. Smoke hangs low in the cold air. Somewhere nearby, two dogs bark furiously over something probably unimportant. Inside the neighbouring cabin, several women sit near the hearth spinning wool while discussing the latest problems around the colony. One family's chimney collapsed during the storm last week. Another household appears dangerously low on supplies. Someone farther down the road has been accused of hoarding grain. That conversation grows quiet the moment you enter. Naturally, communities in colonial New England depended heavily upon cooperation between neighbouring households, especially during harsh winters when illness, storms, or shortages could quickly overwhelm isolated families. Yet small settlements also created environments where gossip travelled rapidly, and personal tensions rarely remained private for long. You sit near the fire while one woman resumes spinning thread with steady, tired hands. The room smells of wet wool, smoke, and onion stew simmering slowly nearby. Nobody speaks immediately. Then someone casually mentions hearing strange noises near Widow Carter's barn during the last storm. Another woman raises an eyebrow. Interesting. You begin realizing that winter boredom occasionally transforms ordinary rumors into full community entertainment. A minor but amusing habit described in some colonial writings involved neighbours quietly inspecting one another's chimney smoke during winter mornings. Thick smoke might suggest plentiful firewood. Weak smoke could indicate shortages. Entire conclusions about household fortunes apparently floated directly into the sky above the settlement. The spinning wheel hums softly while snow taps against the windows. One man nearby insists certain families waste food carelessly. Another complains that somebody borrowed tools before Christmas and never returned them. A third person claims one household allows their goats indoors too often. Honestly, the goats are becoming socially controversial. You sip weak cider from a wooden cup while the conversation drifts between concern and suspicion. Winter intensifies everything here. Small disagreements linger longer. Minor insults feel sharper. There are simply fewer distractions. Several surviving court records from colonial New England reveal that disputes between neighbours often increase during difficult winters when shortages, property damage, unpaid debts, and shared resources placed heavy strain upon already exhausted communities. Outside later that afternoon, you help a family reinforce part of their roof before another storm arrives. Snow slides heavily from the timbers while icy wind stings your face. Several neighbours gather together hauling ladders, ropes, and replacement boards across the packed paths. And just like that, cooperation returns again, because whatever resentments exist, freezing still remains the larger enemy. A child slips carrying nails across the snow and bursts briefly into tears from embarrassment more than pain. One older man immediately helps him up while pretending not to notice the crying at all. Kindness here often arrives quietly, without ceremony, without speeches or One unusual story preserved in local traditions claimed that some settlers deliberately exchanged small gifts of food during harsh winters, partly to prevent suspicion from growing between households. A shared loaf of bread apparently functioned as both generosity and subtle public relations strategy. Smart honestly, nothing calms colonial tension quite like warm bread. As evening approaches, smoke thickens across the settlement beneath low clouds gathering overhead. Families retreat indoors carrying tools and firewood while lantern light flickers softly through snow-covered windows. You stop beside the well where two women speak in hushed voices about the sick family near the edge of town. One child reportedly worsened overnight. Another neighbour has stopped attending church gatherings altogether. Fear spreads carefully in small places. People notice absences. Researchers studying colonial settlements often emphasise how tightly interconnected communities became during winter months. Information travelled quickly because survival required constant awareness of who needed help, who posed risks, and which household remained stable enough to assist others. Inside the cabin that evening, the fire burns steadily while snow begins falling once more outside. The family shares supper quietly. Thick stew, hard bread, warm cider carrying faint hints of apple beneath the smoke-scented air. Then comes a knock at the door. Everyone looks up instantly. The father opens it cautiously. A neighbour stands outside wrapped heavily in wool with snow gathered across his shoulders. He asks politely whether extra lamp oil might be spared because their supply has nearly vanished. For half a second, silence hangs in the room. Oil remains precious. Winter is far from over. Then the mother quietly rises, retrieves a small container from storage, and places it into the neighbour's hands without argument. The relief on his face appears immediate. One point historians continue examining is how effectively mutual aid networks functioned within colonial settlements during prolonged hardship. Some evidence suggests communities cooperated remarkably well under pressure, while other records reveal bitter disputes and uneven support shaped by class, religion, or personal reputation. Probably both are true. Human beings rarely become saints simply because snow exists. The neighbour leaves with repeated thanks before disappearing into the storm outside. Wind pushes briefly through the open doorway, carrying sharp, cold and swirling flakes into the cabin. Then the door closes again. Warmth returns slowly. The children settle closer beside the hearth while one adult quietly remarks that another family likely would not have shared the oil so generously. Nobody responds directly. Interesting silence. The fire crackles softly while candlelight shifts across tired faces and patched clothing. Beyond the windows, darkness wraps tightly around the colony once more. Neighbours here can mean safety. Neighbours can mean judgment. Neighbours can mean borrowed soup during illness or whispered rumours during church or arguments over fences buried beneath snowdrifts. Sometimes all within the same week. Outside, storm winds drift through the frozen trees beyond the settlement. Inside, families continue surviving together in cramped cabins beneath smoke-stained ceilings, balancing cooperation and suspicion one winter evening at a time. The remedies begin appearing the moment somebody sneezes. Not one remedy either, several. All at once. Colonial medicine during winter feels less like a unified system and more like a crowded argument between herbs, prayers, superstition, boiling liquids, and people confidently applying onion paste to situations that probably never requested it. You sit near the hearth while snow drifts softly beyond the windows, and the sick man from earlier coughs beneath heavy blankets. The cabin smells unusually sharp tonight. Vinegar simmers near the fire, mint leaves dry beside the chimney. Someone has crushed garlic into a steaming broth powerful enough to frighten away both illness and most nearby friendships. A woman kneels beside the hearth, carefully stirring a bitter-smelling mixture inside a clay cup. The liquid darkens slowly over the fire while everyone watches with quiet seriousness. Nobody jokes about remedies here. Too much depends on them. Across colonial New England, most families relied primarily on household medicine rather than formally trained physicians. knowledge passed through generations using herbal traditions, folk practices, religious beliefs, and practical experience gathered from previous winters and previous illnesses. The woman finally lifts the steaming cup toward the sick man. He stares at it with visible distrust. Reasonable honestly, the smell alone suggests either recovery or poisoning, possibly both. Still, he drinks. The children nearby wrinkle their noses dramatically while the adults pretend not to notice. One little girl whispers that the medicine smells worse than the goat from last week. Difficult to disprove. Among the stranger treatments recorded in 17th century households were poultices made from heated bread, onions, mustard, animal fat, or herbs pressed directly onto the body to treat chest illness or joint pain. Some likely provided temporary comfort through warmth alone. Others probably just made sick people smell like aggressively seasoned stew. You glance toward a shelf near the wall, lined with tiny cloth bundles and stoppered jars. Dried plants hang from cords overhead beside the fire. Sage, chamomile, rosemary. Something bitter and unfamiliar. Every household seems to maintain its own little collection of hopeful substances against winter sickness. Outside, wind drifts softly across the settlement roofs while darkness settles over the snowfields beyond. Inside the cabin, candlelight flickers warmly against smoke-stained walls while exhausted voices murmur quietly around the fire. The sick man coughs again, less violently tonight perhaps, or maybe everyone simply wants to believe the remedies are helping. Some modern medical historians suggest certain colonial herbal treatments may indeed have offered limited benefits through hydration, warmth, soothing vapours, or mild medicinal properties. Other remedies, meanwhile, probably succeeded mainly by giving frightened families the comfort of action during uncertain illnesses. That comfort matters too. You notice another preparation simmering near the hearth. This one smells sweeter. Apples boiled with herbs and honey if the household can spare it. Steam curls upward through the dim room, carrying warm, earthy scents that almost overpower the constant smoke. Almost. A surviving account from one New England settlement describes people placing bowls of vinegar near sickbeds because they believe strong vapours purified unhealthy air. Entire cabins apparently smelled like salad dressing during flu season. You help carry heated water toward the sleeping corner, while the fire crackles steadily behind you. The room feels crowded now with blankets, bowls, cloths, and steaming cups arranged around the sick man like defensive tools against winter itself. No sterile hospitals, no electric lights, only firelight, herbal steam, and tired people trying their best best. The oldest woman in the cabin sits beside the bed, quietly rubbing salve into cracked hands while explaining that certain roots work better if gathered during specific moon phases. Nobody interrupts her, partly from respect, partly because she survived more winters than anyone else in the room. Colonial communities often placed enormous trust in older women who accumulated practical knowledge about childbirth, illness, food preservation, and household medicine through decades of lived experience rather than formal schooling. And honestly, experience counts for a lot when half the settlement smells like cough syrup and smoke. The younger children remain fascinated by every strange treatment unfolding around them. One boy asks whether garlic can truly chase sickness from the body. Another wonders if drinking enough hot cider prevents fever entirely. An adult replies vaguely enough to preserve hope without technically promising anything. Parenting strategy remains timeless, apparently. Near the fire, someone heats smooth stones wrapped later in cloth for sore joints and aching muscles. The stones click softly together inside the iron pan, while sparks drift upwards through the chimney smoke. One traveller from the late 17th century described colonial households where sick family members slept surrounded by heated bricks, steaming herbs, wool blankets, and multiple layers of clothing all at once, until the room resembled a particularly exhausted bakery. The storm outside strengthens gradually through the evening. Snow brushes harder against the roof while icy wind rattles the shutters. The entire cabin feels sealed tightly against the weather now. warm but heavy with smoke and human breath. The remedies continue. More tea, more broth, more whispered suggestions. One neighbour swears by boiled pine needles for chest sickness. Another insists mustard plasters work best. Someone else claims prayer matters more than any herb. Nobody fully agrees, yet everyone contributes something. A few researchers continue debating how much indigenous medicinal knowledge quietly entered colonial households through trade. Observation or contact, despite many settlers rarely acknowledging such influences openly in written records. You suspect the exchange happened more often than official documents admit. People facing illness tend to borrow useful ideas regardless of pride. The sick man finally falls asleep near midnight, breathing more steadily beneath the blankets. Around him, the cabin grows quieter, bowls sit abandoned beside the hearth, herbs dry slowly in the rising heat, candle flames flicker low in their holders. You sit listening to the storm while the room settles into exhausted silence. The smell of garlic still lingers heavily in the air, along with the smoke, along with damp wool, along with the faint, stubborn scent of hope. Because in winter 1692 medicine is not merely about curing disease, it is about comforting the frightened. Keeping watch through long nights, boiling water, holding hands, staying awake beside the fire while snow buries the world outside, and believing morning might still arrive. The snowstorm begins before dawn and does not stop. At first, nobody worries too much. Winter storms arrive regularly in the colony. People tighten shutters, stack extra firewood near the hearth, and settle indoors expecting another difficult but ordinary day. Then the wind strengthens. Then the sky disappears completely, and by afternoon the world beyond the cabin no longer exists. You stand near the doorway listening to the snow strike the walls in endless rushing waves. The sound resembles ocean surf somehow, steady and relentless. Every crack around the doorframe whistles softly with cold air, trying to force its way inside. Outside, fences vanish beneath the drifts. Paths disappear. Entire cabins blur into pale shadows through the storm. One reality repeatedly described in colonial accounts is how quickly severe winter weather could isolate settlements. Heavy snowstorms sometimes trapped families indoors for days or even weeks, limiting travel, communication, and access to already strained supplies. The fire burns constantly now. Nobody lets it weaken. The room smells heavily of smoke because opening the chimney properly during strong wind risks dangerous downdrafts. Ash settles across nearby blankets in fine grey dust while wet boots steam beside the hearth. Children sit unusually quietly today. Even they understand something about this storm feels different. You move toward the tiny window and scrape frost gently aside with your sleeve. Nothing but swirling white beyond the glass. The storm erases distance itself. No roads, no trees, no horizon, only snow spinning endlessly through grey light. A curious note from one colonial traveller described storms so intense that families tied ropes between buildings to avoid becoming lost while moving short distances outdoors. Imagine needing navigation equipment just to visit your own chicken shed. The cabin creaks sharply as another gust strikes the roof. Everyone looks upward instinctively. Then silence returns except for the wind. The family begins rationing more carefully by evening. Not dramatically, nobody announces it aloud. Portions simply grow smaller. Bread sliced thinner, stew stretched farther with extra water and barley. Storms interrupt everything. Wood gathering stops, fishing stops. Travel stopped as Sumia Sipri Sabapsa Tomiya. Sometimes even wells freeze hard enough to complicate water access. The mother quietly checks stored food twice before supper, counting supplies by candlelight while children pretend not to notice. Researchers examining climate records from the Little Ice Age suggest some winters in 17th century New England may have produced unusually persistent cold spells and powerful storms capable of overwhelming fragile colonial infrastructure. You believe it immediately. The storm outside sounds endless. Night falls early beneath thick cloud cover. Darkness presses tightly around the cabin, while wind rattles the walls with fresh force. Snow has drifted halfway up the doorway now. Opening it would mean shoveling first. Inside, warmth gathers unevenly around the fire. Everyone stays close together. Even the goat appears emotionally overwhelmed by the weather and has stopped behaving mischievously for once. Honestly, alarming development. One boy asks quietly whether the roof might collapse beneath heavy snow. His father answers calmly that it will hold, then spends the next hour checking support beams anyway. A strange little practice mentioned in scattered winter accounts involved settlers knocking snow repeatedly from cabin roofs during major storms to reduce dangerous weight build-up. Considering the weather outside tonight, this likely felt less like maintenance and more like negotiating directly with nature. You try sleeping eventually. It does not go well. The storm noise changes constantly. Sometimes the wind screams through narrow gaps around the walls. Sometimes snow brushes softly against the roof in whispering waves. Occasionally something outside thumps heavily beneath drifting snow, and everyone wakes instantly trying to identify whether a branch, fence, or entire structure just surrendered. Nobody rests deeply during blizzards. The cabin air grows thick overnight from smoke, damp clothing, and too many bodies crowded together near the hearth. Blankets smell faintly of ash. Candle wax softens in the heat beside the fire, while frost still creeps silently along the outer walls. You wake sometime before dawn to complete silence. No wind, no rattling shutters, nothing. For one strange moment, the absence of sound feels more unsettling than the storm itself. Then someone carefully opens the door. Snow blocks half the entrance. Cold blue morning light spills inward across towering drifts outside. The entire settlement has transformed overnight into rounded white shapes barely recognizable beneath the accumulation. Cabins look buried. Fences vanish completely. Even familiar trees appear distorted beneath thick frozen layers. Several historical descriptions from New England winters mention snowdrifts reaching extraordinary heights around homes and pathways, especially after prolonged storms combined with coastal winds. The father and older boys begin digging immediately, shovels scraping snow, heavy breathing, clouds of frozen air drifting upward. Every movement looks exhausting. You step outside briefly, and the cold hits with shocking clarity after the warm, smoky cabin. Sunlight glitters painfully bright across endless snowfields beneath clear skies finally emerging after the storm. Beautiful. Blinding. Dangerously cold. The colony moves slowly this morning. Doors open carefully one by one as neighbours emerge from buried homes carrying shovels and tired expressions. Voices drift softly through the still air while paths are carved back into existence. One woman laughs suddenly after uncovering her completely vanished laundry fence beneath the drift. The laughter spreads oddly fast, perhaps because everyone feels relieved simply seeing one another alive again. Some historians remain uncertain how frequently severe blizzards caused complete settlement isolation, compared with shorter interruptions exaggerated later through storytelling. Yet nearly every surviving winter diary from the region describes storms powerful enough to reshape daily life for days at a time. Back inside, the fire burns brighter again now that fresh air moves through the chimney properly. Wet mittens dry near the hearth while snow melts from boots onto the floorboards. Children grow louder immediately after the danger passes. One already wants to tunnel through the snowdrifts outside. Another asks whether wolves could walk directly across the buried fences now. Reasonable concern, honestly. The family shares hot broth while sunlight glows pale through the windows. The cabin still smells of smoke and wet wool and boiled onions. But beneath all of it lingers another feeling now. Relief. The storm passed. The roof held. The fire survived. And somewhere beyond the towering snowdrifts surrounding the colony, spring still waits patiently beneath all that frozen white silence. A few days after the storm, the colony begins moving again. Slowly, carefully, like stiff joints waking after too much cold. Paths reopen between cabins. Snow gets shoveled from roofs. Smoke rises steadily once more through pale morning skies. Yet beyond the settlement, the wilderness still looks untouched and immense beneath the winter sun. You follow a narrow trail leading toward the forest edge, where several men prepare for a hunting trip. Snow reaches nearly to your knees in places despite packed pathways. The air smells sharp and clean after the storm, filled with pine sap and frozen earth hidden beneath the drifts. One hunter pauses suddenly and points toward a line of tracks crossing the snow. Not deer, human. The footprints move lightly across deep drifts in a way none of the colonists manage comfortably. A quiet respect settles over the group. Colonial settlers in New England frequently encountered indigenous winter survival techniques that proved far better adapted to harsh northern conditions than many European practices initially brought across the Atlantic. You continue deeper through the trees where sunlight filters blue and silver across untouched snow. The forest feels strangely silent except for the occasional creak of branches overhead. One man speaks quietly about snowshoes. Apparently several nearby indigenous communities travel across winter landscapes with remarkable speed, while colonists stumble around sinking waist-deep into drifts like emotionally overwhelmed furniture. Fair comparison, honestly. Not every settler adopts local methods immediately, though. Pride complicates survival more often than anyone would prefer. A number of surviving records suggest European colonists gradually borrowed practical winter knowledge involving hunting, insulation, food preservation, trail making, and cold weather travel despite often minimizing indigenous contributions in official accounts. You reach a frozen stream where the ice glows pale beneath snow cover. One older hunter kneels beside the bank studying animal tracks while explaining how certain native hunters read winter forests almost like written maps. Broken twigs, compressed snow, tiny disturbances invisible to inexperienced eyes. The colony still struggles learning this landscape properly. One fascinating detail appearing in frontier stories describes indigenous travelers constructing temporary winter shelters from evergreen branches and packed snow during hunting journeys. Some colonists reportedly viewed these shelters with amazement after spending years trying unsuccessfully to stay warm inside drafty wooden cabins. Honestly, understandable reaction. You continue walking while icy air burns faintly inside your lungs. Every breath feels painfully clean compared with the smoky colony air left behind. Snow crunches beneath boots and crisp rhythmic sounds echoing softly through the trees. Nearby, one hunter unwraps strips of dried meat preserved using methods partly learned through trade with local native communities. The meat tastes smoky, salty, and tough enough to test your commitment to chewing. Still nourishing, though. That matters most. Across the region, indigenous groups possessed extensive seasonal knowledge, developed over generations of surviving northeastern winters. Their understanding of local plants, animal migrations, ice conditions, and snow travel often contrasted sharply with European settlers still adapting to unfamiliar climates. You notice how differently the experienced hunters move through the forest compared with ordinary colonists around the settlement. Quieter, more patient, less wasteful. Winter punishes unnecessary movement quickly. At midday, the group pauses near a cluster of pines while weak sunlight glows across the snowfields. One man shares stories about native fishing techniques used beneath frozen rivers and lakes during colder months. Another admits quietly that several settlers likely would not have survived earlier winters without local guidance and traded supplies. Nobody says this loudly near church gatherings, though. Politics freezes harder than rivers sometimes. One curious account from the late 17th century describes colonists attempting to imitate indigenous winter moccasins only to discover their own poorly made versions soaked through almost immediately. Turns out copying survival technology requires more than enthusiasm and optimism. You sit beside a tiny sheltered fire while wind brushes softly through the trees overhead. Smoke rises thin and blue into the pale sky. The hunters eat silently for a while, The forest around you feels yet ancient, steady, completely indifferent to the colony struggling at its edge. Researchers continue debating how extensively cultural exchange shaped everyday colonial winter survival during this period. Some evidence points towards significant borrowing of practical techniques, while other historians caution that written records often conceal more complicated relationships involving trade, conflict, dependence, and prejudice. Probably all true at once. Human history rarely fits neatly into simple categories. The hunting party eventually turns back toward the settlement carrying only modest success. One rabbit, a few trapped animals, not enough for celebration, but enough to matter. Everything matters during February. As you approach the colony again, smoke appears above the trees long before the cabins themselves. That smell now means home, or at least temporary shelter from freezing to death. Children run across packed snow paths between the houses, while women hang damp blankets near the afternoon sun. Someone chops ice from the well, someone else repairs a sled runner cracked during the storm. Life continues through repetition, yet small changes quietly appear too. One settler now wears snowshoes modelled after local designs. Another stores food differently than before. A third insulates cabin walls with bark and evergreen layering techniques learned nearby. Winter teaches stubborn lessons eventually. A few scholars examining colonial adaptation argue that survival in early New England depended far more upon indigenous knowledge networks than older traditional narratives admitted. Without local guidance about climate, agriculture, and seasonal preparation, some settlements likely faced far worse outcomes. Back inside the cabin that evening, the fire glows warmly while snow begins falling lightly once more beyond the windows. The family shares stew thickened with rabbit meat from the hunt earlier that day. The taste feels richer than usual. Children listen carefully while stories about winter travel circulate around the hearth. One boy becomes fascinated by snowshoe tracks. Another asks whether forests truly remain silent before storms. The adults answer thoughtfully. Outside, darkness settles gently across the frozen landscape stretching beyond the colony fences. Inside, candlelight flickers against rough wooden walls while voices murmur softly beside the fire. And quietly woven through the colony's winter survival are skills, habits, and knowledge carried across snowy forests long before the settlers ever arrived. After sunset, the colony changes. Daylight allows practical thinking. You can see the woodpile shrinking, the smoke rising from neighbouring cabins, the children slipping on ice beside the well. Problems appear manageable when sunlight touches them. Darkness is less cooperative. You step outside just after evening supper, while snow crunches softly beneath your boots. The air feels painfully cold tonight, clear enough that every star burns sharply above the settlement. Chimney smoke drifts low between the cabins, carrying the familiar smell of pine and damp ash across the frozen paths. Somewhere beyond the trees, a dog begins barking. Then another answers farther away. The sound lingers strangely in the stillness. You pull your cloak tighter without really meaning to. People in 1692 carry more than winter fears through these nights. The colony already lives beneath layers of religious anxiety, superstition, rumour, and the uncertainty. Illness spreads without explanation. Storms arrive suddenly, crops fail, children wake screaming from fevers, strange accidents happen in isolated places. And when human beings lack answers, imagination happily volunteers. Inside one cabin, several women sit near the hearth, sewing by candlelight while discussing unusual events from neighbouring settlements. One swears she heard footsteps outside her window during last week's storm, despite the snow remaining untouched the next morning. Another quietly mentions livestock behaving strangely before a recent illness swept through town. Nobody laughs? Not fully. The fire crackles softly while shadows shift across the walls. Candlelight makes ordinary rooms feel uncertain somehow. Familiar objects stretch into unfamiliar shapes. Hanging coats resemble silent figures. Floorboards creak without warning. You begin understanding how fear grows here. Not dramatically, slowly, like frost spreading across glass. One child asks whether wolves can smell sickness through cabin walls. An older woman replies that wild animals sense weakness better than people do. The room grows quieter afterward. Across much of colonial New England, long winter nights often became fertile ground for stories involving spirits, omens, curses, unexplained noises, and warnings passed between generations. Isolation and exhaustion sharpened anxieties already present within deeply religious communities. Outside again, the moon hangs pale above the snowfields while forest shadows stretch dark and endless beyond the colony edge. The trees appear motionless now, watching somehow. Logically, they are only trees, but winter darkness rarely feels logical. A boy carrying firewood hurries between cabins faster than necessary while carefully avoiding the old storage shed near the meeting house. Apparently several children believe the place haunted after hearing scratching noises there one night. The scratching later turned out to be trapped raccoons. That detail never improves the story, though. One elderly settler quietly recalls hearing about families who hung protective charms near doorways despite strict religious teachings against superstition. Bits of iron, dried herbs, carved symbols hidden discreetly beneath thresholds. Fear makes complicated philosophers out of practical people. Inside the cabin, the wind rises slightly outside while the family settles closer around the fire. Someone reads softly from a Bible near candlelight while others mend clothing or sharpen tools in silence. Then comes a sudden noise overhead. A heavy thump across the roof. Everyone freezes. The dog lifts its head immediately. Another thump follows, sliding slightly this time. Snow shifting, perhaps, or ice falling from higher branches. But for one long second, nobody breathes. Then the father calmly mutters something about loose ice, and returns to sharpening his knife while everyone pretends their hearts did not just attempt escape. Winter nights constantly test nerves. A traveller passing through New England once wrote that darkness in frontier settlements felt crowded with possibilities because ordinary sounds carried farther and explanations arrived slower than fear itself. You understand perfectly now. The colony grows quieter as the evening deepens. Candle flames shrink lower. Children drift towards sleep beneath blankets near the hearth. Outside, moonlight glows across untouched snow like pale silver cloth spread over the world. One woman quietly tells a story about hearing voices during a blizzard years earlier while travelling between settlements. Another insists storms can play tricks on exhausted minds. Neither explanation fully comforts anyone. Several modern scholars, studying the emotional climate of late 17th century New England, suggest that prolonged hardship, religious pressure, political instability, and harsh environmental conditions combined to create communities especially vulnerable to fear and suspicion. And winter intensifies all of it. The cabin air feels thick tonight. Smoke hangs low near the rafters while damp wool dries beside the hearth. The smell of melted tallow from candles mixes with onion broth lingering from supper. Safe smells, human smells, people cling to them. Outside exists too much darkness. A child suddenly wakes, crying from a dream, and immediately reaches for his mother's hand before fully opening his eyes. She soothes him quietly while the fire settles into glowing red embers. Nobody asks what frightened him. Perhaps they do not want details. One particularly persistent rumour circulating in some colonial communities claimed certain crossroads or forest clearings became dangerous after midnight during winter months. Whether these warnings reflected genuine spiritual fear, practical concerns about freezing outdoors, or simply attempts to keep children from wandering into storms remains unclear. Probably all three. The wind weakens gradually near midnight. Snow crystals sparkle beneath moonlight outside the windows while the settlement rests beneath deep silence once more. You sit awake a little longer beside the dying fire, listening to the occasional creak of timber and the soft breathing of sleeping people around you. Beyond the walls waits the endless frozen wilderness. Beyond it, unknown distances stretching farther than anyone here truly understands. And inside this small smoky cabin, surrounded by candlelight and whispered prayers and old fears carried through generations, you realize something quietly important. Winter does not merely freeze the body, it magnifies the imagination. Every shadow grows longer, every noise feels meaningful. Every lonely path between cabins after dark becomes a story waiting to happen. The final embers pulse softly red beside the hearth. Outside, snow gleams beneath the moon, and somewhere far beyond the sleeping colony, a wolf howls once through the cold night air. The evenings belong to repair work. Once darkness settles across the colony, and outdoor chores finally slow beneath the freezing sky, families gather near the hearth with whatever still needs fixing, which turns out to be nearly everything. You sit close beside the fire while candlelight flickers warmly across the crowded cabin. Snow taps softly against the windows tonight, gentle compared with the earlier storms. The room smells comforting now in its familiar complicated way. Smoke, wool, hot stew. Animal fur, melted candle wax, a faint trace of pine resin warming near the hearth. Around you, hands remain busy even after supper ends. The father sharpens a blade worn dull from splitting wood. One older girl patches torn mittens with careful uneven stitches. Another family member twists candle wicks while melted tallow cools slowly in shallow moulds beside the fire. Nobody wastes evening hours during winter. Darkness simply shifts the work indoors. Long winter nights often became productive hours for household manufacturing in colonial settlements. Families repaired tools, spun thread, carved wooden utensils, prepared candles, mended harnesses, and produced countless small necessities beside firelight after daytime labour ended. You watch one boy carving tiny pegs from scrapwood while trying very hard to appear grown and responsible. Every few moments he glances toward the adults for approval without fully lifting his head. One peg snaps in half. He quietly hides the evidence beneath the bench. Reasonable strategy, honestly. Near the wall, strips of wool hang drying beside repaired stockings waiting for morning. The older woman spins thread steadily, her wheel humming softly through the room like a sleepy insect. The rhythm becomes hypnotic after a while. Spin, pull, twist, fire crackling gently beneath it all. A small but memorable detail preserved in several household accounts describes families saving even the tiniest scraps of cloth, leather, or candle wax because replacement materials remained expensive and difficult to obtain during winter months. Entire colonies quietly survived on the principle of perhaps this broken thing can still become another smaller broken thing. You warm your hands beside the fire while the mother pours melted tallow carefully into candle moulds. The smell grows stronger instantly. Heavy, greasy, slightly unpleasant. Colonial candles rarely carry the soft, comforting scent of modern vanilla kitchens and cheerful autumn festivals. These smell like hard-working livestock making one final contribution to domestic lighting. The children complain about the odour every winter. The adults ignore them every winter. One traveller passing through New England once remarked that evening cabin light often looks strangely golden because smoke and tallow flames softened everything into warm shadows. Faces blurred gently, walls glowed amber, even exhaustion appeared calmer beside the fire. You understand what he meant. The room feels almost peaceful tonight despite the endless labour. Outside, darkness presses against the windows while frozen trees creak faintly beyond the settlement. Inside, tiny ordinary tasks continue one after another beneath candlelight. A glove repaired, a spoon carved, a button replaced. Survival built quietly from small, careful actions. The father tests the knife edge against his thumb before nodding with satisfaction. Nearby, another man repairs a cracked snowshoe frame using thin strips of soaked rawhide that tighten as they dry near the hearth. Nothing gets abandoned casually here. Not tools, not clothing. Not people either, if they can help it. Several surviving probate inventories from colonial households reveal astonishingly small numbers of possessions compared with modern standards. Families often owned only a few sets of clothing, limited cookware, simple furniture, and carefully maintained tools expected to last for years, which explains why everyone repairs things constantly instead of dramatically throwing them away after minor inconvenience. You glance toward the sleeping corner where the youngest children already lie bundled beneath blankets near the fire. One still clutches a carved wooden toy missing one wheel from earlier rough play. Someone will probably repair that too. An elderly woman near the hearth begins telling stories while her hands continue sewing almost automatically. She speaks about winters years earlier, when snow buried entire fences and wolves wandered close enough to hear breathing beyond cabin walls. The children listen with wide eyes. One candle flickers sharply in a draught. Perfect timing. Among the stranger habits occasionally mentioned in colonial winter writings was the practice of reusing worn wool garments as insulation, mattress stuffing, bandages, cleaning rags, or eventually kindling after every other possible use had been exhausted. Fabric apparently enjoyed several full careers before retirement. The spinning wheel hums again. Outside, wind shifts softly through the trees. The cabin settles deeper into evening rhythms. One young woman embroiders tiny decorative patterns into an otherwise practical collar, while pretending not to notice another person watching admiringly from across the room. Even winter colonies apparently contain flirtation. History refused, becoming completely grim. You help trim cooled candles while warm tallow hardens against your fingertips. The finished candles look rough and uneven compared with modern versions, but they will provide precious light through more freezing nights ahead. That matters enough. Researchers studying domestic labour often emphasise how much skilled craftsmanship existed within ordinary colonial households. Tasks like spinning, sewing, woodworking, preserving food, and tool maintenance required knowledge developed through years of repetition and observation. You can see that expertise everywhere. In the smooth movements of practiced hands, in the careful conservation of materials, in the quiet confidence people carry while fixing things by firelight. The evening stretches onward slowly. More logs settle into the hearth with soft bursts of sparks. Someone reheats cider near the coals while another carefully checks drying herbs hanging overhead. Beyond the cabin walls, winter remains vast and cold and indifferent. But inside this small glowing room, human beings continue creating warmth from labour and routine and stubborn patience. The final candle gets set aside to cool completely. The repaired mittens fold neatly beside the hearth. The sharpened tools return to their hooks. Tomorrow the colony will wake again to more snow, more hauling, more cold mornings and aching muscles. But tonight, for a few quiet hours beside the fire, the work slows into softer motions. Needles passing through cloth, wood shavings curling onto the floor, voices murmuring gently beneath the steady breathing of sleeping children. And overhead, smoke drifting lazily upward through the dark rafters while the winter night deepens beyond the windows. By late winter, people stop opening food bushels with confidence. Every lid lifted now carries uncertainty. You notice it one grey morning while standing near the storage chest beside the hearth. The mother kneels carefully beside sacks of grain that already look thinner than they did a month ago. Her movements remain calm, but slower somehow. Measuring, calculating, quietly worried. The cabin feels colder today despite the fire burning steadily. Perhaps because everyone understands February is ending, but spring still seems impossibly far away. Outside, snowmelt begins appearing along the edges of roofs during brief afternoon warmth, only to freeze solid again by nightfall. The settlement smells different now, too. Less fresh snow, more wet wood, mud hiding beneath ice. A difficult stage of winter. Colonial families often entered the final stretch of winter with supplies running dangerously low, especially if earlier harvests had been poor or storms disrupted hunting, fishing, and trade routes during the coldest months. You watch the father slice remaining smoked meat into portions so thin they appear almost philosophical. Nearby, one child asks whether supper will include bread tonight. Nobody answers immediately. That silence says enough. Meals have changed gradually over recent weeks. Stews contain more water now, more roots, fewer visible pieces of meat. Bread loaves shrink smaller while bowls empty faster. Nobody complains much. Hunger makes people quieter. One elderly neighbour arrives carrying a sack of dried peas for trade. In exchange, the family offers lamp oil and repaired tools. Bartering increases across the colony this time of year, because actual coin remains scarce and survival matters more than elegant financial systems. Honestly difficult to pay with silver when what you truly need is potatoes. Several letters and account books from colonial settlements describe late winter as the hardest period for food reserves because reserved supplies often dwindled before fresh spring planting or successful hunting became possible again. The neighbour removes his glove slowly beside the fire. His hand shakes slightly from cold and age together. He mentions hearing that another family near the shoreline has already slaughtered breeding chickens earlier than planned due to shortages. Bad sign. Very bad sign. Animals intended for future eggs or labour rarely get sacrificed unless desperation begins outweighing long-term planning. The room smells strongly of cabbage soup simmering over the hearth. Steam fogs the windows while damp wool hangs drying nearby. Everything feels humid and smoky at once. One boy quietly scrapes crumbs from the cutting board into his bowl after supper preparation finishes. Nothing gets wasted now, not even crumbs. A strange little survival trick mentioned some household writings involves stretching flour by mixing it with ground peas, chestnuts, or coarse root vegetables during difficult winters. The resulting bread apparently possessed the texture of determined disappointment but kept people alive. You step outside carrying wood chips toward the fire pile. The settlement paths have turned uneven and dangerous as melting snow refreezes into jagged ice overnight. Every step threatens embarrassment or broken bones. Several cabins look worn now, roofs sagging slightly, smoke drifting weaker from certain chimneys. People moving slower through the cold mornings. Late winter exhaustion settles across the colony like another layer of weather. A woman near the well pauses midway through lifting water, leaning briefly against the wooden frame before continuing. Nobody comments. Everyone feels tired now. Not dramatic exhaustion, just constant depletion. One day blending into the next beneath grey skies and shrinking food stores. Researchers examining colonial nutrition believe many settlers likely endured periods of chronic undernourishment during harsh winters, especially children and poorer households with limited access to preserved meat or imported supplies. Inside another cabin, a family shares boiled turnips and weak broth while discussing rumours of incoming trade ships once coastal ice clears enough for safer travel. The conversation sounds almost dreamy. Fresh flour, salt fish, molasses, maybe apples. People speak about future food the way modern people discuss vacations. One child claims he would gladly eat 6 whole onions if given the chance. The adults laugh harder than the joke deserves. Probably because everyone is hungry, A peculiar detail appearing in scattered winter diaries mentions colonists occasionally chewing pine needles or spruce tips during late winter because fresh greens became scarce after months without proper produce. The taste reportedly ranged from refreshing to deeply regrettable depending on enthusiasm and chewing commitment. Back in the main cabin, the mother carefully unwraps a final precious bundle hidden beneath folded cloth. Dried berries. Only a handful remain. The children stare as though witnessing treasure. She drops several into the evening porridge. The entire smell changes instantly. Sweetness. Faint but unmistakable. For one moment the room brightens emotionally. Amazing what berries can accomplish after 4 months of cabbage. Outside, thawing snow drips steadily from the roof edges beneath pale afternoon sunlight. Crows gather noisily near the edge of the settlement where patches of frozen earth begin reappearing through the ice. The colony senses change coming. Not warmth exactly, but movement, a slow turning beneath the season. Some historians studying early settlements note that communities surviving late winter shortages often depended heavily upon cooperation, flexible trade, and careful rationing rather than individual household self-sufficiency. Few families truly survived difficult seasons entirely alone. You see that clearly now. Shared soup, borrowed grain, extra firewood delivered quietly after dark. One family lending tools while another shares preserved fish. Survival stitched together from many small exchanges. Evening settles softly across the colony once more. The fire burns lower while supper bowls sit nearly empty beside the hearth. Children drift towards sleep wrapped tightly beneath blankets patched and repatched through the season. The goat snores faintly from its corner, somehow still indoors. At this point nobody questions it anymore. You sit listening to the slow drip of melting snow outside the cabin walls, while smoke curls lazily overhead. The air feels slightly softer tonight. Not warm, just less cruel, and though the food stores remain frighteningly thin, though exhaustion still hangs over the settlement like smoke beneath the rafters, people continue preparing for tomorrow. Another meal? Another soul this year's morning survived. Because winter has not defeated them yet, the first sign of spring arrives quietly, not with warmth, certainly not with flowers dramatically bursting across the frozen colony while cheerful birds perform emotional musical numbers overhead. No, spring in 1692 begins with dripping water. You hear it before you fully notice it. A slow, steady tapping outside the cabin one pale morning, while smoke curls lazily from the chimney into softer air. Snow still blankets the settlement, but something underneath has begun loosening. Drip. Pause. Drip. The sound feels almost shocking after months of frozen stillness. You step outside wrapped in your heavy cloak, though today the cold bites less fiercely at your face. Roof edges glisten with melting ice. Dark patches of earth emerge beside pathways trampled hard through the winter. The entire colony smells different suddenly. Wet wood, mud, cold water. Not pleasant exactly, but alive. Children notice the change first. They always do. One boy already splashes deliberately through slushy puddles despite immediate adult protests. Another stands proudly holding a chunk of broken ice like some rare treasure discovered at the edge of the world. The adults pretend annoyance. Privately, everyone feels relieved. The settlement itself seems to exhale. Doors remain open slightly longer during daylight hours. People linger outside talking instead of rushing immediately back indoors. Blankets and clothing hang beneath pale sunlight, carrying away months of smoke trapped deep inside the fabric. You help drag soaked straw from the animal shelter while muddy water seeps around your boots. The ground beneath the snow feels soft and unstable now. Every path across the colony is transformed into a slippery battlefield between thawing ice and thick brown mud. Winter never leaves politely. One woman laughs while nearly losing a boot entirely to the road beside the meeting house. Two children immediately attempt the same dangerous step intentionally. Naturally, inside the cabin, windows open briefly for the first time in weeks. Fresh air moves through the room carrying sharp, damp scents from outside. Smoke escapes more freely now. So does winter's accumulated heaviness. The difference feels enormous. You'd forgotten air could smell clean. A man near the hearth remarks that the chickens have begun laying more regularly again. Another claims he heard geese flying overhead before dawn yesterday. These tiny signs spread through the settlement faster than gossip. Everyone watches the season carefully now. One elderly woman insists she can predict the true arrival of spring by how the crows sound in the mornings. Nobody fully believes her. Nobody fully dismisses her either. Along the edge of the forest, snow shrinks unevenly beneath the trees. Streams hidden all winter begin moving again beneath cracked sheets of ice. The sound of running water returns softly to the landscape after months of silence. You walk carefully toward the shoreline where chunks of broken ice drift slowly along dark water beneath cloudy skies. The ocean smells stronger now too, saltier somehow, less trapped. Several settlers stand nearby studying the harbour hopefully. Once the ice clears properly, ships may finally arrive again carrying flour, tools, cloth and letters from worlds beyond the frozen colony. For months the settlement has existed almost alone. Now connection slowly returns. Back near the cabins, women scrub winter grime from blankets and clothing beside steaming kettles, while children chase one another through muddy snowbanks. The laughter sounds louder outdoors after so many months indoors beside smoky fires. Even the dogs seem happier. The goat remains suspicious of all weather changes. Consistent personality, honestly. You notice people smiling more now, though exhaustion still clings heavily to everyone. Winter has left its marks. Faces thinner, hands roughened. Food stores nearly empty. Several roofs sagging from storm damage. Yet the colony endured. That realization settles quietly across the settlement as the thaw continues day by day. One afternoon, you stand beside the well watching sunlight flash across melting snow while distant hammering echoes through the village. Repairs have already begun. Fence posts straightened, roofs patched, boats inspected near the shore. Spring means work immediately. Always more work, but this labour feels different from winter labour. Lighter somehow. Forward-looking, inside the cabin that evening, supper smells richer than it has in weeks. Someone traded successfully for fresh fish near the shoreline. The children practically vibrate with excitement while waiting for bowls to reach the table. Fresh food after a winter of salted everything feels almost miraculous. Steam rises warmly through the room while open shutters let cool, damp evening air drift softly inside. Candlelight flickers across faces no longer drawn quite so tightly with worry. One child asks whether snow will return again. The adults exchange glances. Then someone answers carefully. Probably, but not like before. That matters. You sit quietly beside the fire after supper, listening to water dripping steadily outside the cabin walls. The sound continues through the night now. Roof edges thawing, snowbanks shrinking, tiny streams forming through the settlement paths beneath moonlight. The season is changing one drop at a time. Outside, the dark forest no longer looks entirely hostile beneath the stars. Somewhere beyond the trees, birds call softly through the damp night air. The sound feels unfamiliar after so much winter silence. The cabin itself changes too. Blankets smell less smoky after hanging outdoors. Damp wool dries faster now. Even the fire burns smaller some evenings, because constant brutal cold no longer presses against the walls with the same fury. People sleep differently, looser, less curled tightly against themselves. You realize then how deeply winter shaped every movement inside the colony. How carefully everyone measured food, how closely they guarded warmth, how heavily silence settled during storms. And now, slowly, life begins stretching outward again. Doors opening, paths widening, voices carrying farther through softer air. Outside the cabin, water continues dripping steadily from the roof beneath pale moonlight. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just steady. The first quiet promise that winter will not last forever after all. The fire burns lower now. Not because the colony fears running out of wood anymore. Though everyone still stacks timber carefully from habit, the season itself has changed. Nights remain cold, but not with the same deep winter cruelty that once pressed frost across the cabin walls before dawn. You sit quietly beside the hearth while evening settles over the settlement one final time. Outside, patches of snow linger stubbornly beneath fences and trees, glowing pale beneath the fading light. Muddy paths wind between cabins where smoke rises softly into the cool spring air. Somewhere near the shoreline, water moves freely again beneath cracked river ice. The colony sounds different now. Axes striking fresh lumber. Children shouting outdoors long after supper. Dogs barking at absolutely nothing with renewed seasonal enthusiasm. Even the birds seem surprised to still exist after winter. Inside the cabin, the room feels larger somehow. Windows remain cracked open slightly. Damp wool no longer hangs everywhere near the fire. The heavy smell of smoke still lingers in the rafters, woven permanently into the timber itself, but fresher air moves through now carrying traces of wet earth and pine. You realise how many months passed with everyone simply enduring. One freezing morning after another, one repaired mitten after another, one carefully measured meal after another, and yet people survived. Not elegantly, perhaps, not comfortably, but steadily. The children who once huddled silently beneath blankets during storms now chase one another through muddy snowbanks outside the cabin until their mothers drag them indoors for washing. The sick man near the hearth breathes easier now. Though winter left him thinner and slower than before, the goat still wanders indoors occasionally. At this point it practically pays rent. You glance around the room, noticing small evidence of the season that shaped everyone here. Patched clothing folded neatly beside the wall. Wooden bowls worn smooth through constant use. Tools repaired again and again beneath candlelight. Nothing appears luxurious. Everything appears necessary. That may be the truest lesson winter taught the colony. A woman near the fire quietly mends one final tear in a child's sleeve while speaking softly about spring planting. Her voice sounds lighter now, less burdened by immediate survival. People think about the future again. That alone feels extraordinary. Outside, the twilight spreads slowly across the settlement. Meltwater drips from roof edges in soft, steady rhythms, while evening mist gathers near the dark tree line beyond the colony. You step outdoors one last time. The air feels cold but gentle. After everything winter demanded, gentle cold almost feels warm. The cabins stand scattered beneath the dimming sky, their rough timber walls stained by smoke and weather and long months of endurance. Some roofs lean slightly now. Several fences remain half buried in melting snow. Yet candlelight glows through the windows one by one as families gather indoors for supper. You imagine how fragile the colony must have appeared when winter first arrived. How uncertain everyone felt, and still, somehow the fire stayed burning. A distant laugh drifts across the muddy road, while someone unloads supplies from a small coastal boat finally able to reach the settlement again. Children gather nearby hoping for imported sweets or strange stories from outside the colony. The world beyond winter returns slowly, but the memory of cold remains close. People will carry it into summer, into harvest season, into every woodpile stacked higher next autumn, because nobody wishes to repeat those hungry February evenings again. You walk toward the edge of the settlement where snow fades gradually into exposed earth, and damp grass flattened beneath months of ice. The forest beyond stands quiet in the deepening dusk, no longer threatening exactly, just watching. The same trees, the same wilderness, but you change while winter passed. The colony changed too. You learnt the smell of wet wool drying beside midnight fires, the sound of ice cracking across frozen rivers, the weight of water buckets carried through storms before sunrise, the strange comfort of hearing neighbouring voices through snow-filled darkness. You learned how people survive, not through grand heroics, but through repetition. Soup stirred slowly over coals, hands repairing torn gloves, neighbours sharing lamp oil, children laughing despite hunger, fires relit before dawn, again and again and again. Back inside the cabin, the final evening settles softly around the hearth. Candlelight flickers against smoke-darkened beams overhead, while tired families prepare for sleep. No one speaks loudly. They do not need to. The worst of winter has passed, and now, as the fire glows low and warm before you, the colony finally exhales. The wind outside no longer sounds angry, only distant, soft, almost sleepy. You sit quietly listening to the gentle crackle of burning wood while darkness wraps comfortably around the cabin walls. Nearby, someone yawns. A child murmurs softly in sleep beneath patched blankets. Water drips steadily outside into thawing earth. The season turns, slowly, patiently, and as your eyes grow heavy beside the fading firelight, the long winter of 1692 drifts gently behind you, like snow melting beneath spring rain. The cabin grows quieter, the embers dim lower. Beyond the windows, moonlight settles softly across the colony roofs, across muddy paths and shrinking snowbanks, across forests waiting peacefully beneath the stars. You breathe in one final time, smoke, pine, warm wool, and the faint, sweet scent of thawing earth returning after the cold. Sleep comes easily now. The fire fades softly into glowing red coals, and somewhere far beyond the sleeping settlement, spring continues moving slowly north through the dark. The night settles fully now, gentle and quiet around the colony. No more storms batter the roof. No frightened whispers drift across crowded rooms. Only the soft breathing of sleeping families and the occasional settling creak of warm timber cooling beside the fire. You remain there a little longer in the dim orange glow, watching the final embers pulse softly like tiny fading stars. Outside, meltwater continues its slow, patient dripping into the dark earth below the snowbanks. Each drop carries winter away, piece by piece. The cabin feels peaceful now in a way it never could during the hardest weeks of February. The air still smells of smoke and wool and old wood, but beneath it lingers spring, damp soil, pine needles waking beneath thawing ice, cold river water moving freely again. The children sleep deeply under their patched blankets. The adults rest heavily too, their tired hands finally still after months of endless labour. Tomorrow there will still be fences to repair and muddy roads to cross and fields to prepare. Life in the colony never truly becomes easy, but tonight survival itself feels enough. You think back to the deep winter evenings when the snow buried the doorways, when candlelight flickered across anxious faces, when every bowl of soup and every armful of firewood mattered so desperately. Those long nights have softened now into memory, carried away like chimney smoke into the dark sky. The fire settles lower. One ember breaks quietly apart. Outside, somewhere beyond the trees, water moves through the thawing forest under moonlight. And with that gentle sound drifting through the night, the colony sleeps peacefully at last. Sweet dreams,